Kristen Smart was born February 20th, 1977, in Augsburg, Germany, but moved to the United States with her parents, brother, and sister at an early age. The family settled in Stockton, California. Her parents worked as teachers for the children of U.S. military personnel. After graduating from high school in 1996, Kristen entered California Polytechnic University. In her spare time, she worked as a lifeguard at the recreation center on campus. On May 25, 1996, there was a big birthday party for one of the students at the fraternity house. Kristen had planned to go, but her friends declined the idea, so she went to the fraternity house alone. That party was held in typical American student style. A large group drank alcohol, listened to music, and had a good time. That night, Kristen drank too much alcohol, felt bad, and around 2 a.m. went to her dorm. But she could hardly walk by herself. When two other students, Shale Anderson and Tim Davis, spotted her on the street and decided to walk her home, they had both been present at the party. After a while, they were joined by another student who had also attended the party, Paul Flores. He offered to walk Kristen to her dorm since he himself lived the closest. Cheryl and Tim, who had to go in the other direction, said goodbye to them and left. No one had seen Kristen alive since then. At first, her disappearance was not given much thought. Christine's roommate, Margarita Campos, was the first to become concerned. She was sure her friend would return home after the party, but she never did. Adding to the anxiety was the fact that all of Christine's belongings, including her passport, wallet, and bank card, remained in her room. That meant she couldn't just pick up and go somewhere. Marguerite did not contact campus police until 2 days after the young woman disappeared. Apparently, she had hoped to the last minute that Kristen was okay and would return home. But campus police didn't take her roommate's statement seriously. It was the weekend before, and it was also the U.S. National Day of Remembrance, which commemorates fallen American servicemen. The local police simply assumed that Kristen had gone home, and they were not confused by the fact that she had left all of her important belongings and documents in the dormitory. On a separate note, it was a 7-hour drive from the university campus to Christine's hometown. Too long a distance to suddenly make such a journey without money and documents, especially in the middle of the night. A few days later, the local police decided to go to work after all and called the young woman's parents. Christine's mother reported that her daughter had not come home in a long time and had not called her in recent days. That call made the mother worried, and the parents went to the police. But even there, the police were not eager to open an investigation. They said that not much time had passed since Christine's disappearance, and she might well have been out with friends, and it wasn't until the 4th day after she went missing that the search began. Volunteers searched for the young woman at first, but the search yielded no results. The first thing the police interviewed was Paul Flores, who had volunteered to walk Kristen to her dormitory door and was supposed to be the last person to see her. He told detectives that he and Shri Kristen walked to her dormitory, then said goodbye, and she went to her house alone. He then allegedly went straight to bed, but this story quickly became inconsistent. Paul's dorm mates saw him go to the shower around 5 a.m., while he and Kristen parted ways after 2 a.m. In addition, the young man had a black eye and scratches on his knees. When asked by several people, he told 3 different stories about where he got all these injuries. Paul Flores seemed highly suspicious, but there was no direct evidence against him. A month had passed since Christine's disappearance, and police had expanded the search for the young woman to her hometown. Journalists there hyped the case, catching the similarity of the story to the plot of the popular TV series Twin Peaks. The news even mentioned certain psychics who had already solved the case. According to their version, the young woman was killed by 2 men on campus and then driven to the cliff and thrown into the water. Of course, these allegations yield nothing to the police. A year after Christine's disappearance, her parents sued Flores, accusing him of complicity in the young woman's disappearance. In 1997, Paul testified under oath, but of all the questions he answered, only one when asked to give his name. On all other occasions, he invoked the Fifth Amendment, which allows a defendant not to testify against himself. Paul's parents then sued Christine's family for moral damages, but both of these lawsuits went nowhere. The police had no evidence to prosecute Paul. On May 25, 2002, the 6th anniversary of Christine's disappearance, authorities officially declared her dead. In all that time, they also failed to come any closer to solving the case. This went on until 2018, when a California resident, Chris Lambert, decided to start his own podcast series on various crimes. He was 8 years old at the time of Christine's disappearance, and he remembered the creepy story well from the news. 22 years later, he decided to do his own investigation and was struck by how neglectful the police had been all along. The first thing Chris did was to talk to all the witnesses to those events. He learned from university students that Paul Flores had a bad reputation. The young man had repeatedly molested female students, but it never came to official complaints. Chris further analyzed the actions of the police and came to the conclusion that they had made a number of critical errors. The detectives did not arrive at the home of Paul's father, Ruben Flores, until 2 months after the young woman had disappeared. Given that Paul was living with his father, the police should have investigated the residence immediately. But when the police did arrive to search it, they were extremely sloppy. The detectives did not bring a forensic specialist or a police dog trained on the smell of decomposition. Because of this, the search was essentially useless. The detectives also failed to examine the 2 cars of the Flores family, one of which Paul may have used to drive Kristen from the campus to her father's house. Several months after the police visit, one of the cars was sold and the other was allegedly stolen. The police never showed up at Paul's mother's house, and that was where one of the main clues was hiding. Chris Lambert discovered that 4 months after Kristen Smart disappeared, a woman named Mary Lassiter had rented Paul's mother's house. In one of the rooms, she discovered a necklace link very similar to the one Kristen was wearing. This necklace was also in the pictures posted all over the city. She immediately took the evidence to the police, but they refused to accept it as evidence and then lost it altogether. Also, Chris found out that the backyard of Paul's mother's house had always been concreted, but shortly after the young woman disappeared, a small piece of concrete was cut out. A flower bed had been planted in that spot. Mary Lassiter told Lambert a very eerie story. Every day since moving in, Mary had heard sounds coming from that very flower bed. Every day, at the same time, at 4:20 in the morning, and at 4:20 in the afternoon. She would hear this sound very much like a wristwatch alarm. Soon the sound stopped. Most likely the watch's battery died. With this story, Chris went to Christine's mother. Miss Smart told him that her daughter did set the alarm for 4:20 in the morning, since she had to be at work at the recreation center at 5. Lambert's podcast aired in 2019. Millions of listeners came away outraged at what they had heard. They were struck by the negligence and inaction of the police. The evidence Chris found further shocked listeners. Despite much circumstantial evidence, Paul Flores is still at large. Public pressure led the police department to reopen the investigation into Kristen Smart's disappearance. The first thing investigators did was search the Flores family's homes, and vehicles were seized. Forensic investigators finally dug up that ill-fated flower bed, but no body was found there. Despite the fact that there was no body, the experts managed to establish that there were traces of decomposition of the human body in the ground. On April 13, 2021, Paul Flores and his father were arrested. Paul was charged with Christine's murder, and his father was charged as an accomplice. According to the investigation, Paul began molesting the young woman after Tim Davis and Cheryl Anderson left, but was rebuffed. This could explain the injuries on Flores' body. After the fight, Paul could have killed Kristen and then taken her body to his house. Seeing what his son had done, Flores' father decided to help him hide the corpse. Together, they took the young woman to her mother's house and buried her in the backyard, which was later replaced with a flower bed. Sometime later, apparently afraid of police harassment, the suspects dug up the grave and took the remains to an unknown destination. Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder by a Monterey County jury and faces 25 years to life in prison. His father, Ruben Flores, was charged as an accessory to the crime. He faces up to 3 years in prison. Christine's parents issued a proclamation thanking Chris Lambert and all concerned people for their family's grief that even after many years of their daughter's disappearance, this case is finally solved. One thing they wonder is, didn't Flores' mother have any idea her son's crime had been committed? The flower bed that was unexpectedly planted in the backyard didn't raise any suspicions in her mind? Or maybe she had known all along what had happened that night, but out of love for her son, she had chosen to keep quiet. Of course, some questions would remain unanswered, but that didn't matter now. Perhaps one day the young woman's remains will be found, and Kristen Smart will find peace. Haley Dodd was born on November 30th, 1981 in England. When the girl was young, her parents, along with other children, moved to Australia, settling in the small town of Mandurah. The young woman was an excellent student, played sports, and planned to go to study to be a veterinarian or a school teacher. But before finally deciding on a choice of future profession, she wanted to travel around Australia. Graduating high school in 1999, at the age of 17, she set off on a trip to Western Australia with her best friend Lisa. Their plan wasn't just to drive through local towns and attractions, but to spend a few months away from home. The young women were going to look for temporary jobs along the way to cover their living, food, and travel expenses. They planned to hitchhike between cities, which in the 1990s in Australia didn't sound like such a dangerous idea. At the time, there had been a number of murders of young women hitchhiking in the country, but compared to the overall number of people hitchhiking safely, these crimes did not cause any mass fear. However, Haley feared that her parents would not allow her to travel that way, even in the company of a friend. For this reason, she assured them that she planned to travel by bus. At the end of July, she and Lisa traveled to a town called Dungara. There, they were going to work as day laborers on a local farm. They were staying at a camping site where they could get a place to sleep for a small fee. Such places are in high demand in Australia, mainly because of their cheapness. A few days before going to work, Haley decided to use the remaining free time and go to a farm to family friends, which was 200 kilometers away. She decided to hitchhike to it, and Lisa didn't want to let her go alone. But Haley insisted she had nothing to worry about and would be back in a few days. To say goodbye, Lisa gave her her folding knife for self-defense and some change so Haley could call her from the phone booth. After saying goodbye, she hit the road at about 8 a.m. Family friends at the farm awaited her arrival, but Haley never showed up. Worried, they called her mother and informed her. The woman feared something might have happened to her daughter, so she immediately called the police. The first thing she did was to dial an emergency number and describe the situation. After listening to her story, the operator thought that nothing urgent had happened, so she advised her to go to the local police department and file a missing person report. So she did. The detectives began their search for Haley, beginning to reconstruct the chronology of events. The first thing they did was arrive at the campsite where Lisa was staying. She was mortified at the news that her friend had never made it to the farm, but the young woman was able to give the police a comprehensive introduction. She accurately described all the clothes Haley was wearing that day and even drew a sketch of the earrings she was wearing for the police. Haley had bought these earrings a few days before the incident. She and Lisa had gone to the store to treat themselves to some inexpensive items, and the young woman was attracted to this jewelry. At that time, she couldn't have imagined that those earrings would be the key to solving this terrible mystery of her disappearance. Detectives disseminated information about the missing young woman along with her description. Although she was almost 18 years old, Haley looked much younger. She was 152 centimeters tall and weighed just over 40 pounds. The police were able to locate the first witness fairly quickly. It turned out to be the truck driver who had given her a ride that day. According to the man's story, she had knocked on his cab window at a gas station and asked for a ride to Mora, a town near where there was a farm. The trucker was on his way to another town, but he agreed to give her a ride most of the way. The man dropped her off at a turnoff about 50 kilometers from Mora, near the town of Vajangara, where she was to turn off the main road and onto a country road. According to the trucker, Haley was in high spirits, chatting with him the whole way and talking about her journey. After she said she was almost out of money, he gave her $15 so the young woman could buy something to eat. The man also left her his number in case she hitchhiked back. He made trips down that road almost every day and could have let her down again. Later, detectives received several more calls from people who had seen Haley in that area. Based on their statements, police concluded that the young woman had been on foot along the northwest road towards Mora. Apparently, she could not find any driver at the gas station to give her a ride. For this reason, she decided to walk along the road and try to hitch a ride. Based on the testimony of the next witness, he gave Haley a ride to the turnoff on Gunderdo Road, after which she headed further in her direction on foot. The next witness was a woman driving along the road. She spotted Haley just as the young woman was getting out of her car and moving on foot towards Mora. In all, the police were contacted by more than 10 witnesses. After putting their statements together, detectives concluded that the young woman was last seen at about 12 noon on the Northwest Road, about 50 kilometers from Mora. There was another witness, though. He had not seen Haley, but still shared a disturbing observation with police. The man pulled over on the side of the Northwest Road because his engine was overheating. At one point, he heard a dog barking, followed by a piercing female scream. He couldn't see the source of the sound, as it might have been far enough away. The road passed through an empty flat area where there was virtually no extraneous noise. With all this information in hand, the police's prognosis was disappointing from the start. Lead Detective Eddie Rowe decided that they should look for the body and not consider the possibility that Haley might be alive. But management forbade him to investigate in such a manner, leaving it to the status of the search for the missing person. It's worth clarifying here that a murder investigation would have given the police more options than a missing person investigation. But the police had no leads that could help them get on the young woman's trail, so they quickly set about looking for potential kidnappers. In a short time, they were able to identify several dozen suspects who lived in the area, but eventually the police focused on 3 men. One worked as a teacher at a local school, another was a part-time gardener there, and the third lived not far from where Haley disappeared. When questioned, each of them pleaded not guilty and provided alibis. The police could not conclude with certainty of their innocence, but they could not find any evidence to the contrary. But soon the situation changed dramatically. The investigators were approached by a neighbor of one of the suspects, a 43-year-old school gardener named Francis Wark. He told them that the day Haley disappeared, Francis borrowed his car to go shopping in Mora. When the man returned home around 1 p.m., a neighbor noticed damage inside the car. The turn signal knob was broken, and the dashboard also showed signs of impact. The neighbor didn't even have time to ask what happened to the car. Francis came home, dumped the shopping bags in the kitchen, got on his motorcycle, and drove off. This story seemed strange to the police, and they decided to re-interview Francis. The man said that at the time of Haley's disappearance, he was many kilometers away from the alleged place of her abduction. According to his story, after returning home, he immediately went to a party in the city of Perth on his motorcycle. But he was not supposed to get there that day. On the way there, he exceeded the speed limit and had a serious accident that took him to the hospital. The information available was enough for the detectives to ask the perfectly logical question: Where was he going in such a hurry? His own testimony seemed very strange, and investigators decided to apply for a search warrant of his home. The officers searched his residence, but they were unable to find any potential evidence. They also searched the car and removed the seat covers so that experts could examine them in the lab. Unfortunately, none of this yielded any results, and Francis was left alone. Almost immediately after that, he moved to the other side of the country, to Queensland, and the detectives were left empty-handed, and the case went into a long drawer. They tried to find new witnesses and evidence to move the investigation forward, but to no avail. This went on for 8 whole years until Francis came back on the police radar in 2007. At the time, he was living in a remote outback in a small settlement. One morning, an elderly couple who lived next door to him were sitting on the porch of their house. At some point, they noticed with horror that a young woman with absolutely no clothes was running in their direction, and her head was covered with blood. She asked for help, and the residents of the house called the police. The victim said that she had tried to catch a ride the night before. A man stopped in front of her and offered her a ride. At one point, he told her he needed to go to a place to get gas and fill up his car. They drove up to a house in the middle of nowhere, and he called the woman inside and offered her some tea. Unfortunately for her, she said yes. Almost immediately thereafter, he attacked her, and after a brief struggle, tied her up. For the next few hours, the victim was subject to indescribable torture and violence. Her assailant also tore off one of her earrings and took it for himself. As you may have guessed, this man was Francis. By morning, the woman realized that she could get the rope off her hands and then free her legs and run. She loosened the rope, waited for the right moment for Francis to move as far away as possible, and rushed to the back door of the house. Before she left, she removed her pendant and tossed it under the bed. The woman feared that the police might not find any corroboration of her story, so she decided to leave some personal item in his house, and it really worked. The police searched Francis's house, found the very same pendant, and arrested the man. At the trial, he quickly realized that he could not get away with it and decided to confess to what he had done. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The police in Western Australia, who handled the Haley Dodd case, were notified of Francis's arrest, but they did not appear to be at all interested. No action was taken by the detectives to revive the 8-year-old case, which was so closely resembling the circumstances of Francis's crime. Only through the insistence of Haley's mother did the detectives agree to reopen the case, but they quickly concluded that there was still no evidence against Francis, which meant there was nothing they could do about it. All these years, Haley's family tried to get the police to investigate thoroughly, but they assured them that they had done everything in their power. Desperate to wait for help from law enforcement, the relatives spent tens of thousands of dollars on private investigators, but all to no avail. The case did not take a new turn until 6 long years later, in 2013, when an extremely outrageous fact came to light. It turned out that the police had simply forgotten about the evidence that ended up being the key to the case. The medical examiner, Tracy Horn, filed a request to reopen the investigation. The reason was that the very same car seat covers seized from Francis's neighbor's car in 1999 were found in evidence storage. Suddenly, it turned out that for 14 years, they had never been tested for blood, DNA, and other evidence. When experts did retrieve them, they were immediately able to find a woman's earring that had snagged on the fabric of the covers. Taking a drawing of Lisa's, which she drew for the police just after her friend's disappearance, detectives were horrified to see. It was the same earring that Haley was wearing the morning of her disappearance. But that wasn't all. A human hair was found on one of the car mats that had also been removed from the car. Experts extracted a DNA sample from it that showed a match to Haley Dodd's mother's DNA. That meant that the hair was very likely Haley's own. but that probability was not 100%, which made it very difficult to prosecute Frances in the shortest possible time. As soon as the news leaked to the media, a wave of criticism poured in against the police. For 14 years, this evidence lay literally under the noses of the investigators, but in all that time, they never remembered it. Of course, such a find instantly changed the course of the case, and the detectives went to the other side of the country to interrogate Frances again. At the time, he was still in prison for assaulting a woman in 2007. The man gave them the same story he had told them 14 years earlier. He denied his involvement and assured them that he was shopping in Mora at the time of Haley's abduction. The interrogation, which lasted nearly 4 hours, was inconclusive, so the police had to prepare the case to go to trial. It wasn't until 2015 when he was formally charged with Haley's murder and deported to Western Australia. 2 more years later, in late 2017, the trial began. Frances's defense insisted that all the evidence presented was circumstantial. The earring Haley bought at a local store was very cheap and popular, so it could have been left in the car by another woman. The hair found in the car showed an almost 100% match to Haley's DNA, but not an absolute exact match. Although a mistake here would have been highly unlikely, that was enough for the lawyers. But all these arguments seemed unconvincing to the judge. Perhaps Frances would still have had a chance to get away with it if not for his crime in 2007. But then he didn't just kidnap a woman who was hitchhiking, he also took her earring. The prosecution believed that the man was collecting the victim's earrings as trophies, which only increased the suspicion against him in the end. As a result, the judge found him guilty of kidnapping and murdering Haley Dodd, sentencing him to 21 years in prison. All of this took place while his previous sentence was still pending. Frances was 62 years old at the time of his sentencing, but the story did not end there. The court believed Frances kidnapped and killed Haley, then hid her body, but it was never found, and the man himself refused to plead guilty. Haley's mother repeatedly asked the killer to tell her where he hid the body, but to no avail. And in 2018, she helped pass a new law that says murderers are not eligible for parole if they refuse to reveal the location of their victims' bodies. In 2020, another high-profile event occurred. The court granted Frances appeal to overturn his sentence and scheduled a new hearing. His lawyers again tried to insist that the man would not have had time to kidnap Haley between his trip to Mora and his return home, but the court felt that the time frame allowed him well enough to do so, especially given the rush with which he arrived home and immediately set off for Perth on his motorcycle. Moreover, the earring, along with the hair, were still on the list of key evidence against him, but Frances still managed to get his sentence changed. The court found him guilty of involuntary manslaughter, reducing his sentence from 21 years to 18 years. But thanks to a law passed in 2018, he would not be able to go free even after that time if he refused to identify the location of the body. There is another point in the whole story that keeps the detectives busy to this day. They are sure that many more women have become victims of Frances and that none of them managed to escape. This maniac could have been picking up young women on the roads for decades, and what happened to them next only he knows. One of the most likely similar cases is the disappearance of a woman in late 2005. She hitchhiked to another city and was never seen again. The detective handling the case is certain that Frances kidnapped her because he knew the victim personally, but there is no evidence at this time. Perhaps the police will find it again in their warehouse a few years later, but it won't make a difference to the perpetrator. If the police had examined the car more thoroughly, Frances would have been arrested back in 1999. Now we can only guess how many lives he ruined in the ensuing years, but sooner or later, the mystery may be solved. There's another creepy thing about this whole story. Remember that in the initial stages of the investigation, the police identified 3 main suspects including Francis? Now, one of them killed his wife 5 months after Haley disappeared, and the other, who worked as a school teacher, turned out to be one of the worst child molesters in Australian history. Too bad the police had no way to solve them at the time. Sally Ann Bowman was born on September 11, 1987 in London. She grew up in a large family with 3 older sisters. Her parents, Linda and Paul, later divorced, but the girl continued to maintain a good relationship with her father. Sally was a cheerful and friendly girl with a big heart. At the same time, she was also very responsible. Already in her teens, she got a job and came to live in rented housing. The girl did not want to depend on her parents financially, but continued to see her family regularly. Later, Sally enrolled at the prestigious London School of Performing Arts and Technology, BRIT. This institution is known for such alumni as actor Tom Holland, Adele, and Amy Winehouse. Sally dreamed of working as a model, and the fact that she was able to enroll at this school was a big step towards her cherished goal. Graduating in 2004, she spent some time working as a hairstylist and model. But in January 2005, she landed a job with a London-based model agency, Pulse Model Management. From the first months, Sally has achieved impressive success in the new work. She became the face of the popular watch brand Swatch and took part in prestigious fashion shows. As a result, by the age of 18, she had already managed to build a successful career. On Saturday, September 24, 2005, Sally went to visit her mother and spent most of the day at her home. Later, her older sister, Nicole, called her and invited her to her best friend's birthday party. Sally agreed and left her mother's house around 6 p.m. At the end, she said she loved her. At 10 p.m., the young woman met her sister and her friends at the Lloyd's Bar establishment in downtown Croydon. Surveillance footage at the bar showed Sally having a great time. The company was partying, socializing, and dancing. At about 1 a.m., Sally left the bar with her sister. They walked to her house, but the young woman didn't stay there long. On the way, she called her ex-boyfriend, Louis Sportster, and arranged to meet him in downtown Croydon. At about 2:30 a.m., she got in a cab and drove to the designated location. During the meeting, there was an argument between them. They had broken up only a few weeks earlier over mutual grievances and have been trying unsuccessfully to resolve the situation ever since. Louis decided to give her a ride home on Blenheim Crescent, and they continued to argue the entire way. The couple worked out the relationship until about 4:15 a.m., at which point Sally got out of the car and headed home. At about the same time, neighbors were awakened by an unexplained noise that changed to screaming. People ran to the windows, but there was nothing suspicious going on outside. 5 minutes later, they only saw an unknown man walking down the street. At about 6:30 a.m., one of the neighbors came out of the house and noticed something strange. From behind a nearby construction container, looked out something that he first mistook for the legs of a mannequin. But as soon as he came closer, a frightening sight awaited him. There lay the half-naked body of a dead woman. She turned out to be Sally Bowman. The police quickly arrived on the scene and sealed off the area. They were unable to find the murder weapon, but experts later found DNA on the woman's body from an unknown man. They also discovered that Sally had been stabbed at least 7 times with a sharp object and had been abused. The unknown maniac had even left several bite marks on her body. Sally's family was shattered by this news. When her mother heard a knock on the door this morning, she thought it was Sally coming home. But there were police officers on the doorstep who informed her of her daughter's murder. Hours later, Sally's mother and sister had to go to the morgue to be identified. They hoped to the last that it was all one big mistake and that Sally was really alive. It wasn't until they saw her body that they realized it was really her. Meanwhile, the police launched an investigation, and the first thing they did was run a DNA sample from the woman's body through the databases. But that didn't help them identify the perpetrator. There was also no cameras in that area, which only made the job more difficult. Investigators determined that Sally was killed just 10 feet from the door of her home. Her path from her car to the building was also very short. Her attacker must have attacked her almost immediately after she left the car. The first thing the police suspected was her ex-boyfriend, Lewis. He was the last person to see Sally, and her murder occurred almost immediately after she got out of the car. Investigators also found out that the couple had often quarreled in the past. Several times it even went as far as calling the police, but no charges were ever filed. On the same day, the police tracked him down and arrested him. When questioned, he stated that he didn't even know Sally was dead until the detectives themselves told him about it. He admitted that there had indeed been an altercation between them that night, but denied any involvement in the murder. According to his version, as soon as Sally got out of the car, he drove away. The investigators were in no hurry to take the guy's word for it, because things looked really not in his favor. He spent 4 days in custody while detectives waited for the results of a DNA test. Eventually, it was discovered that his DNA did not match the sample, and Lewis was released. At the same time, experts discovered another interesting detail. The DNA sample found on Sally's body appeared in a criminal case 4 years ago. In 2001, a woman called from a phone booth located in the parking lot of a convenience store. At some point, a man entered the booth, stripped naked, and committed lewd acts. He did not touch the woman and fled, but left his DNA on the floor of the booth. The victim went to the police, and a sample of the pervert's DNA was attached to the case. However, they were never able to find the perpetrator. All of this happened not too far from where Sally was killed, 2.5 kilometers away. The police realized that they were dealing with a serial pervert who had been on the loose for years. The only question was how many women had suffered at the hands of this maniac and when he would strike next. Detectives had to find him before he ruined someone else's life. It soon became clear that the police's fears were not in vain. Just an hour before Sally's murder, a woman had been attacked on a nearby street. She was walking home, talking on her cell phone. At some point, a man approached her, apologized, and immediately struck her. The woman screamed and dropped her phone, but what happened next was something the attacker clearly did not expect. A taxi cab appeared on the road, and that frightened him away. He grabbed the victim's phone and fled. One creepy thing worth noting here: the person on the other end of the line, the woman was still on the line and heard everything. Even after the perpetrator took the phone and disappeared from the victim's sight, her cries for help did not become any quieter. That meant he was hiding quiet nearby. Perhaps he hoped that the cab driver would drive by and the victim would be at his disposal again. Fortunately, the driver heard the screams and stopped. He put the woman in the car and took her to the hospital. There, she called the police and told them what had happened. According to her description, the attacker was a white male, 25 to 30 years old, about 180 centimeters tall, with short, dark hair. On the basis of this data, the police compiled a sketch, which was published in the media. Alas, a large number of men fell under such a vague description, so detectives received hundreds of calls from local residents. They all said that the sketch looked like someone they knew or had seen a similar man somewhere. Each such call was checked by the police, but it yielded no results. When they realized they would not be able to find the maniac from the sketch, the investigators decided to go another way. The only lead they had was a DNA sample found on the victim's body. In addition, the detectives were sure that the perpetrator lived in the area. This was evidenced by the fact that he had also attacked a woman in a phone booth on a nearby street. As a result, the decision was made to DNA screen the entire neighborhood. Police officers were to go to every apartment and house, ask questions, and ask residents to volunteer their DNA samples. Of course, the detectives did not expect the perpetrator to give them his DNA, but it was enough to get a sample from his relatives to get them closer to catching the culprit. For example, the man may have lived with parents who are unaware of his atrocities and would willingly provide his DNA to the police. For the next 6 months, police officers went to more than 6,000 1,000 addresses, and many area residents provided their DNA samples. But the entire operation came to nothing. Despite law enforcement's efforts, experts at the lab found no matches with the perpetrator's sample. All the while, the people of Croydon were in fear, and police rounds only increased the anxiety. They all knew there was a maniac on their streets. Women were afraid to walk at night. Parents would not let their children go out. As a result, the police had to go back to the sketch since there was nothing else to work with. They contacted the woman who had been attacked by the maniac on the day of Sally's murder, as well as the victim from the phone booth. They were asked to re-describe the perpetrator's appearance, and based on this testimony, the detectives compiled an adjusted version of the sketch. The police showed it at a press conference and, for the first time, revealed some details of the crimes committed, which up to that point had been kept secret. This was done in the expectation that the citizens of Croydon would realize how dangerous maniacs walk freely on their streets and would be more careful. Alas, all this also yielded no results. The updated sketch was not much different from the previous one and was too generalized. Thousands of men who lived in the area fit it. But what happened next was something no one expected. A completely random breakthrough in the case. A man was sitting in a bar watching soccer, and after drinking heavily, he began to argue with one of the patrons, and soon their conflict turned into a scuffle on the street. Unfortunately for him, a police officer walked by as he pushed his opponent to the ground. He apprehended the attacker and took him to the police station. There, something strange began. The instigator of the conflict, Mark Dixie, 35, went into a real panic and almost cried. This was very illogical behavior since he had been arrested for a misdemeanor. Most likely, no charges would have been filed by his opponent at all, and the man was free to go home. The police found him very suspicious, but they soon had to release him on bail. Before that, they conducted the standard procedure for all detainees, taking his fingerprints and a DNA sample. 12 days passed, and the detectives received a call from the lab. The experts made an unexpected announcement. Mark Dixie's DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on Sally's body. Investigators realized they had a dangerous maniac on their hands, but they let him go. In any case, the law would not allow them to hold him any longer, and now the police had to re-arrest the perpetrator. Unfortunately for them, Dixie escaped to Amsterdam as soon as he was released. The British authorities put out a search warrant for him, but the man successfully escaped. This went on for 3 months until something strange happened. The criminal quarreled with the owner of the apartment he was renting in Amsterdam and returned back to England. Moreover, he got a job at his previous place of work, making the work of the police much easier. On June 28, 2006, almost a year after the murder, he was finally arrested and this time charged with a whole series of serious crimes. After examining his background, police found that Mark had a very rich criminal history. He committed his first crime in 1986 when he was 16 years old. He attacked a woman with a knife, robbed her, and committed depraved acts. He was sentenced to only 6 months in prison because of his age. Each subsequent year, Mark was put on trial again for robbery and molestation. And in 1990, he was arrested for assaulting a police officer. Unfortunately, all of these times the court system was favorable to him. The man received little time and continued to commit crimes. In 1993, he moved to Australia, where he picked up where he left off. 5 years later, he broke into a young woman's home, robbed and abused her. He was then arrested for exhibitionism in a park and deported from the country in 1999. Unfortunately, in those years, the police were not yet collecting DNA samples from criminals, so Dixie's DNA from the murdered woman's body showed no matches in existing databases. The police had a lot of work to do before taking the case to court. They discovered that the night Sally was killed, Dixie was celebrating his birthday at a bar with friends on Brighton Road, a few hundred yards from her home. He argued with his girlfriend over the phone and spent the rest of the evening abusing alcohol and illegal substances. He withdrew into himself and had little contact with anyone. After the bar closed, Mark and his two girlfriends went to a house nearby. Waiting for them to fall asleep, the man took a knife and went outside. According to the investigation, he was the one who attacked the woman who was saved from death by a cab driver. Fearing that she would call the police, Mark left for another street. Unfortunately, that's when Sally Bowman got out of the car and headed for her door. He attacked her, abused her, and fled. Apparently, it was him walking down the street that the neighbors saw from their windows that night. After killing Sally, he went back to his apartment and quietly went to bed. Mark Dixie's trial began on February 5, 2008. He refused to admit his guilt, instead making up a really ridiculous story. According to his version, he was just walking down the street and saw Sally laying on the ground. He took advantage of the situation, abused her and left, and someone else killed the woman. Dixie claimed that he allegedly did not know the woman was dead. During the trial, a woman from Australia was also found who Dixie attacked in 1998. He abused her, stabbing her 7 times, but never punished her. The jury unanimously found Dixie guilty of Sally's murder, despite his ridiculous history. As a result, the court sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum sentence of 34 years. After that, he was transferred from one prison to another several times, as each time his cellmates bullied him and tried to kill him. All this time, Mark continued to deny his involvement in the murder, and it wasn't until 2015, 10 years later, that he confessed. This did not make his situation any worse, but the police were able to prove his involvement in the other crimes. In 2017, it turned out that an innocent Dutch citizen had served 12 years in prison for an attack on 3 women in Spain, which was in fact committed by Mark Dixie. In addition, the perpetrator also voluntarily confessed to another assault, which he committed when he was 16 years old. Dixie attacked a woman in a parking lot, abused her, stole her credit cards, and set her car on fire. That same evening, he found out her home phone number, called her, and began taunting the victim. The woman then moved to live in the countryside because she could not cope with her trauma. That same year, Dixie was found guilty of assaulting 2 women in Croydon, for each of which he received another life sentence. 2017 was marked by another unpleasant event. Sally's family had to exhume her remains because unknown vandals kept desecrating her grave. The family decided to cremate her and leave her ashes at home. After all of this ordeal, Sally's mother is a strong advocate for a national DNA database. In her opinion, if the government collected DNA samples of all British residents, such crimes would be solved in 24 hours instead of 9 months. In addition, the woman was certain that if the perpetrator had not left his DNA at the scene, Sally's ex-boyfriend would have gone to prison for life for a murder he did not commit. The detective leading the investigation in Sally's murder supported the idea of a DNA database, but the government rejected it. In their view, forced DNA collection would violate basic human rights. This issue is very controversial. On one hand, such a database would really help solve such crimes in a matter of hours. In addition, some criminals would not dare to commit atrocities at all, knowing that they could be identified very quickly. On the other hand, not every criminal leaves their DNA behind. Also, leaking or misusing information from such a database could really hurt law-abiding people. Sherry Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957, in the state of Washington. She grew up in a large and friendly family with 2 sisters and loving parents. Later, they moved to the city of Tucson, Arizona, where Sherry attended the local school. She was an excellent student and even finished elementary school a year ahead of her peers. Sherry completed the entire 7th grade program on summer vacation by herself. After graduating from high school in 1973, she enrolled in a California college, where her older sister was already studying. In her first year, Sherry decided to pursue a medical education and become a nurse, for which she had to take additional courses at another institution. After graduating from college in 1975, Sherry decided to get a master's degree at the University of California, Los Angeles, and also worked there as a nurse to pay for her education. After receiving her master's degree at the age of 23, her father bought her an apartment in the suburbs of Los Angeles. But Sherry did not want to live off her parents, so she wrote her father a check every month for the entire amount of the mortgage payments. She also got a job at a local hospital, heading the nursing department for caring for seriously ill people. In May 1984, when Sherry was 27 years old, she met a man named John Rutan. They immediately hit it off and the couple started dating. John had a good education, worked as a computer engineer, and was a very intelligent young man. A year later, the couple decided to get married, and after that, John moved into Sherry's apartment. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Jamaica, after which they returned home to celebrate Christmas with Sherry's family. It seemed that this couple was destined for a happy and carefree future. On February 24th of the following year, when John was getting ready for work as usual, Sherry complained of feeling unwell and decided to stay home. She asked John to call her in a few hours. At around 7:20 a.m., John left for work. Closer to 10 a.m., John tried to reach her by phone, but she didn't answer. Half an hour later, he tried again, but still no answer. So he called her workplace to check if she had gone to work, but Sherry hadn't shown up at the hospital either. Her sister also tried to reach her, but without success. John returned home from work at around 6 p.m. and immediately noticed something strange. The garage door was open, even though he had closed it in the morning, and Sherry's car was missing. Therefore, he first thought that she had gone somewhere. As he approached the garage, he saw a lot of broken glass and immediately discovered its source. There was a small balcony above the garage with a glass door which had been smashed. He entered the house through the garage and, to his horror, found Sherry there. She was lying on the floor, her body badly disfigured. John immediately called the police and detectives began to examine the crime scene. In all the rooms, there was complete chaos. Broken vases, overturned furniture, scattered items. A bloody handprint was found on the wall next to the alarm button. Apparently, the victim tried to reach it, but failed. In addition to extensive bruises and wounds, experts noticed a human bite mark on Sherry's wrist. Apart from all of the above, the marks on her hands indicated that the attacker tied up the victim before untying her. The cause of death was 3 close-range gunshot wounds. Detectives found a blanket with bullet holes in the apartment and concluded that the attacker wrapped the gun in it to muffle the sound of the shots. Detectives immediately concluded that there was a prolonged struggle between the attacker and Sherry. This was evidenced by the amount of scattered and broken items throughout the apartment, as well as a bloody mark next to the alarm button. The lead investigator quickly concluded that they were dealing with a failed robbery. According to his opinion, at least 2 criminals broke into Sherry's apartment, but they didn't expect her to be home. A struggle ensued between them and Sherry fought for her life until the end. Several facts supported the robbery version. Firstly, Sherry's car disappeared from the garage. Secondly, someone had placed the stereo equipment and player next to the staircase leading to the second floor. According to the police, the robbers wanted to take them and leave, but after the scuffle and murder, they fled the scene. However, there were some dubious moments in this version. Firstly, the police did not find any signs of forced entry. This meant that either Sherry let the criminals in herself or they had a key. Secondly, the perpetrators did not touch absolutely all the valuable items, including the jewelry box standing in plain sight. Detectives interviewed all of Sherry's neighbors, but it didn't yield any new leads. Some residents heard the sounds of a struggle, but not gunshots. They also didn't see anyone entering the woman's apartment. Experts took blood samples and fingerprints from the house, but they couldn't conduct DNA analysis in 1985. The lead investigator also took a piece of cotton and soaked it in the trace of the bite on Sherry's body. He hoped that the attacker's saliva could be left behind, and eventually, Experts could use this clue to catch the killer. After a thorough search of the apartment, detectives learned one interesting fact. It turned out that the criminals took only one thing: Sherry and John's marriage certificate. This was very strange and also raised suspicions about the man himself, but his alibi was unquestionable. John was at work until the evening, and he simply couldn't have committed this crime. Moreover, he himself told the police about the disappearance of this document. Detectives were unable to find an explanation for this strange fact. After a week and a half, they found Sherry's car in a parking lot 4 kilometers from her apartment. It was unlocked and the keys were in the ignition. Forensic experts tried to find fingerprints, but they were unsuccessful. Either the criminals only touched it with gloves on, or they wiped away all the fingerprints. 2 months after the murder that took place just a few hundred meters from Sherry's home, a robbery occurred. Detectives immediately found many similarities. 2 criminals broke into a stranger's apartment through the garage, threatened the owner with a gun, and stole stereo equipment. The lead investigator immediately thought that these 2 were behind the woman's murder, so the police tried to find them. From witness accounts, they created approximate composite sketches of the suspects and also learned that both men were Latino, but they were never found. However, investigators did not show much interest in getting to the truth, which constantly irritated Sherry's parents. Her father regularly went to the police station, inquired about the progress of the investigation, and asked the detectives to consider different versions. Once he even asked them to take a closer look at John's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, who was a police officer herself. Sherry had told her father several times that she was obsessed with John, but the investigators only laughed at this version. They told him to watch fewer detective shows. The thing was that Stephanie couldn't accept John's departure. Learning that he was going to marry another woman, she came to Sherry's workplace. Stephanie told her that their marriage was doomed and that she and John would be together again sooner or later. In addition, she said that John had slept with her already after becoming engaged to Sherry. Of course, after this visit, Sherry was deeply upset. Upon returning home, she told John what had happened, and he admitted that he had indeed slept with Stephanie. After she found out about his engagement, the young woman begged him to come over, spoke of her love, and urged him to return to her. But he said he loved Sherry and intended to marry her. Then Stephanie offered to sleep with him one last time, and John agreed. He apologized to Sherry and said it was a huge mistake on his part. The woman forgave him, and this incident with Stephanie gradually faded away. But the story didn't end there. Stephanie came to their home several times without warning under various pretexts. Once she came with a set of skis and announced that John promised to wax them for her. The next time she entered their apartment when the man was not at home. Sherry did not even hear how she entered the room and was shocked to see Stephanie in her living room. When asked what she was doing there, the woman said she came to talk to John. Sherry had a hard time convincing her to leave. Later, she even thought of going to the police about this incident, but did not. The woman was afraid that if she told about the harassment by their own employee, they would just laugh at her. She also wondered how Stephanie managed to enter the residential complex. It was surrounded by a high fence, and a special pass was required to enter. Apparently, the woman used her police badge, and the security let her in. As for Stephanie's apartment, there had to be a duplicate key. Otherwise, she simply could not have entered without breaking the lock. In addition to this, Sherry repeatedly noticed that someone was following her. Once, she and John were sitting in a restaurant, and the woman saw someone staring at them intently. As soon as she looked at this person, he immediately left. Sherry did not see his face because it was covered with a hood. Unknown calls also regularly came to their home phone, and Sherry suspected it could be Stephanie. The victim's father told detectives about all these incidents, but they did not attach any importance to his words. They were sure that the murder was committed by the 2 Mexicans who robbed an apartment near Sherry's home. 3 months after the murder, something interesting happened. Some documents from Sherry's case disappeared from the police station. Among them were records of detectives about the progress of the investigation. They had to record almost every step related to the investigation of this crime. But at one point, the police simply could not find these journals. However, there were no important leads there anyway. Since then, the case has been hanging for years. Detectives did not show much desire to look for new leads, despite constant pressure from Sherry's parents. 8 months after the murder, Sherry's father offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find the perpetrator. A year later, he held a press conference where he again promised a reward for information, but in both cases, it yielded no results. 7 years later, the lead investigator on the case retired. The victim's father decided to meet with his successor, hoping that he would take his job more seriously. Additionally, it was 1993 and DNA analysis technology was already being actively used by the police to solve crimes. Sherry's father asked the detective to perform such an analysis and even offered to fully pay for it. However, the detective stated that it was pointless since they did not have a single suspect with whom to compare the obtained DNA profile. Meanwhile, John started a new family, but at some point, he reunited with Stephanie. They planned to go to Hawaii together, but something unusual happened before that. The man called the detective and asked if they had any new evidence indicating Stephanie's involvement in the murder. Apparently, he himself suspected that the woman might have done something like that. However, all these years, he was afraid to talk about it, although this did not prevent him from sleeping with her again. As for Stephanie herself, she was quickly climbing the career ladder in the police department. She received higher ranks, twice became Detective of the Year, and had an impeccable reputation. She also married another police officer, but this did not prevent her from regularly sleeping with John. In 2001, a separate unit was formed in Los Angeles to work on unsolved murders. They were given Sherry's case along with thousands of similar cases, and the detectives began sorting through them gradually. They briefly studied each case, trying to understand which ones had the greatest chance of being solved. For example, murders without any clues were pushed to the end of the queue, and cases with DNA samples of possible suspects were marked as the most promising. Sherry's murder made it onto this list because among the evidence was a piece of cotton that could have contained the perpetrator's saliva, left behind after a bite. 2 years later, detectives picked up the case and sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Due to high demand, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results until January 2005. Among the evidence were nail fragments and blood samples from the apartment. All of them contained only Sherry's DNA, and the forensic scientists only had to study the sample from the bite mark on her body. Problem was that they couldn't find the vial with this evidence for a whole day until they finally discovered it by the wall of a large refrigerator. After studying the sample, experts found foreign DNA belonging to an unknown woman. This profile was immediately run through the FBI database, but it wasn't there. Detectives speculated that this woman could have committed the robbery with another criminal, or 2 female robbers could have broken into Sherry's apartment. The investigators still believed that the murder occurred during a robbery. Therefore, they didn't consider any other versions. After they failed to find any new leads in this direction, the case was put on hold. This continued until February 2009, when a new detective took up Sherry's case and began studying the materials left by other investigators. Seeing that DNA from another woman was found at the bite mark on the victim's body, he questioned the robbery version. Detectives considered that the motives for this crime could be completely different, so they decided to compile a list of all the women who could potentially be related to Sherry's murder. As a result, they managed to collect 5 names. Among them was Stephanie, the victim's colleague at work, and 3 other young women. The detectives initially doubted Stephanie's involvement, considering her reputation and successful career in the police. For this reason, he first decided to check the other suspects. Together with other investigators, they fairly quickly concluded that 3 women from this list had no connection to Sherry's death. They lacked motives and had alibis. After that, they began to investigate the nurse who worked with Sherry. The case file stated that they had rather tense relations, and the police secretly obtained a sample of her DNA from the trash she threw away. Experts extracted the profile and found that it didn't match the saliva found at the bite mark location. Thus, the detectives had only one suspect left: Stephanie. He and several colleagues agreed to keep this information secret until they could obtain solid evidence or disprove this theory. None of them wanted to accuse a police officer with an impeccable reputation of murder, and Stephanie could easily ruin their careers using her connections. They began secretly gathering information on her, trying to find any connection to the murder. Interestingly, the woman worked in the same building on the same floor as them. Because of this, the investigators had to take many precautions and not even mention her name in their notes. Soon, the detectives discovered the first interesting fact. During the years of the murder, Stephanie owned a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun that was used to shoot Sherry. They also learned that the victim had repeatedly complained about strange and even aggressive behavior from Stephanie. The fact that the police officer came to Sherry's workplace in her uniform and said rude things to her seemed suspicious. Even more suspicion was added by the fact that Stephanie had broken into Sherry's gated community and even into her apartment several times. After analyzing the reports and photos from the crime scene, the detectives concluded that the possible robbery seemed staged. Nothing was taken from the apartment, not even the valuable items that were prominently displayed, but instead only a player and stereo were taken away. Moreover, the shooter had to be well versed in how the gun worked. In extreme conditions, he was able to wrap the gun barrel with a blanket in such a way that the neighbors did not hear a single shot. It is unlikely that a low-level thief of players could possess such skills, but a trained and experienced police officer could. Another fact indicating Stephanie's involvement was a stolen marriage registration certificate found in her apartment. Why would some random burglars look for this document and take it with them, leaving a whole box of jewelry behind? But for Stephanie, it could have had a significant symbolic value. Perhaps killing Sherry was not enough for her, or she had planned to break into her apartment only for this document, but the woman caught her in the act. In the end, the detective learned that 2 weeks after the murder, Stephanie came to the police station and filed a report of theft. According to this information, someone had broken into her car, which was left near the pier, and stolen several items, including a sports bag, clothes, videotapes, and a .38 caliber revolver. Given all the facts presented, the moment with the gun seemed very suspicious. Detectives suspected that she intentionally got rid of the weapon, disguising it as a theft. Furthermore, she filed a report at a different police station where nobody knew her, which seemed very strange since her colleagues would have taken the case with the utmost responsibility. As a result, the detectives decided to obtain a DNA sample from Stephanie. Several officers undercover followed her for a week until they finally had the opportunity to get it. On May 28, 2009, Stephanie and her stepdaughter stopped at a cafe for a snack. As soon as they left, the officers took the glass she drank from and sent it to the lab. The next day, the result was ready: a full match. Despite the many factors pointing to Stephanie's involvement, the detectives were still shocked. It was hard for them to believe that a high-ranking and respected police officer was connected to the murder, but the DNA results were indisputable. However, at that moment, they did not have time for these thoughts, and investigators began developing a plan to arrest her. None of them wanted to do this in the middle of the police station, in front of hundreds of officers. Moreover, Stephanie had extensive connections, and the detectives decided to lure her away from prying eyes. The chief of the Los Angeles Police Department was unofficially informed that one of his subordinates was suspected of the murder. The chief ordered the detectives not to approach Stephanie while she had her service or personal weapon with her. He also considered the idea of arresting her in her own home risky, since she lived with her husband and stepdaughter. The detectives began to think about how to get the person who outranked them to surrender their weapon. And soon they had an excellent idea. In the basement of the police department, there were holding cells designed for temporary detention of criminals. So anyone entering there had to surrender their weapon. To lure her there, a legend was created. Stephanie had extensive experience working in the department that dealt with art thefts. Therefore, on June 5, 2009, two detectives with hidden microphones approached her and asked for help. They said they had arrested a suspect who may have some information about stolen paintings. The detectives admitted that they were not familiar with all the details and needed the help of an experienced professional. Stephanie agreed and went with them to the basement where the suspect was supposed to be held. After the woman surrendered her weapon, they went to the interrogation room, but there was no suspect there. Instead, the detectives gradually and very carefully laid out the cards on the table, asking Stephanie questions about Sherry's murder. At first, they simply said that they needed to ask her a few questions about an old case related to her ex-boyfriend. Over the course of an hour, they smoothly led the dialogue to a discussion of the murder itself, but Stephanie said that she hardly remembered Sherry, as it was all a long time ago. Finally, the detectives announced that they had obtained the killer's DNA and asked Stephanie to provide her DNA sample for comparison. At that point, the woman immediately said that she was not going to give her DNA, refused to talk further without a lawyer, and decided to leave. The detectives let her go, but several policemen with handcuffs were waiting for Stephanie at the end of the corridor. 23 years after the murder, the woman was arrested. Considering Stephanie's vast police experience, all attempts to talk to her during interrogations led to no results. She knew the situation perfectly. There was DNA evidence against her, found at the bite mark on the victim's body, and it was extremely difficult to dispute this evidence. Nevertheless, she denied her involvement and insisted on her innocence. As a result, the detectives had no choice but to prepare documents for the transfer to court. Over the next few years, Stephanie was held in a woman's prison until the first hearings began in 2012. It took the police 3 years to basically rebuild the case from scratch. Because their predecessors blindly believed in a failed robbery, it was necessary to redo all the materials and focus specifically on Stephanie. At the trial, the woman continued to insist on her innocence. Her lawyer questioned the DNA test results and also pointed out that there were no suspicions against Stephanie during the initial investigation. But all these arguments turned out to be completely unconvincing. The prosecution believed that on that day, Stephanie waited for John to leave for work and entered Sherry's apartment. She went upstairs, shot Sherry once, but Sherry managed to resist and a struggle ensued, which moved downstairs. Ultimately, Stephanie killed her, staged a riot in the apartment, creating an illusion of a burglary. She then found a marriage certificate and left the scene. After her arrest, detectives discovered that Stephanie had boasted to colleagues about her lock-picking set, and they found several books on how to pick locks in her home. This could explain how she entered the apartment without leaving any traces of a break-in. A lock of not the best quality can be picked with lockpicks so that no expert will notice any traces. The trial ended on March 8, 2012, and the jury found Stephanie guilty of murder. She received a sentence ranging from 27 years to life in prison, as well as an additional 2 years for using a service weapon. The judge deducted 1,000 days from her sentence, citing the time spent behind bars awaiting trial and her good behavior. Sherry's parents tried to sue the detectives who originally worked the case, despite the fact that the victim's father had been telling them to look at Stephanie from the very beginning. They ignored his words. This raises a reasonable question. Were they deliberately covering up their colleague, or did they really not believe in her involvement? In the first case, it would have been a serious crime, and in the second case, it would have been simple negligence and ignoring significant facts. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had expired in this case, and the court refused to prosecute these police officers. As for Stephanie, she filed an appeal immediately after the trial, but it was quickly rejected. She still denies her guilt while behind bars. At present, she's 62 years old and can file a petition for early release only in 2039. Sherry's ex-husband, John, lost interest in investigating her murder. Almost immediately after it happened, he started a new family, slept with Stephanie for a while, and later moved to another city. Detectives questioned his involvement, but this version seems unlikely. Most likely, he did not know about his ex-wife's plans. Thus, this case could have been gathering dust in archives to this day if it hadn't fallen into the hands of professional detectives. Everyone who worked on it before refused to even consider the version of their colleagues' involvement. Mandy Stavik was born on April 16, 1971, in the American city of Bellingham, Washington. She grew up in a large family with loving parents, 2 brothers, and a sister. Soon after Mandy's birth, her parents decided to move to a town called Palmer, Alaska. This place was known for its picturesque nature, safety, and the unity of its few thousand residents. The family lived in this town for several years, but when Mandy was 3 years old, her parents decided to divorce, and she stayed with her mother. Nevertheless, she continued to see her father almost every day. A year later, a terrible tragedy struck their family. Mandy's 17-year-old brother went on a hunting trip and disappeared. The police later found his body, which had almost 20 bullet wounds. Despite all the investigators' efforts to solve the case, they could not find any suspects. For Mandy's family, this event was a real shock, but she continued to grow up joyful and active. She excelled academically, participated in many sports, and played various musical instruments. When Mandy was 12 years old, her mother decided to move back to Washington, but this time to a small village called Acme, whose population at that time was less than 300 people, and all the residents knew each other well. There were practically no serious crimes in this place, and the woman decided that she and her 3 children would be better off there. Mandy enrolled in the local school, quickly made friends, continued to play sports, joined the school music group, and became a cheerleader. In addition, she loved the local nature and enjoyed going for runs towards the picturesque river. When Mandy was 17 years old, another tragedy struck her family. After the divorce, her father stayed in Palmer and started a new family, having several children, and in 1988, Mandy's stepbrother drowned in a river. It was another blow for her and reminded her of her older brother's death. After graduating from high school, Mandy enrolled in Central Washington University in 1989, which was 3 hours away from her home. She wanted to become a pilot and strove to get straight A's. She lived in a dormitory, but whenever she had the chance, she visited her family. At the end of November, she came home to spend Thanksgiving with her relatives and planned to stay there for a few more days. On November 24th, the day after the holiday, Mandy decided to go for a run. Usually, her mother accompanied her and rode her bike next to her, but this time she stayed home because her sister had come to visit her briefly. So Mandy set off alone, taking the family's German Shepherd with her. Her usual route started from home and ran along the road to the river, after which she turned around and ran back, totaling about 5 kilometers. Usually the run took less than an hour, but this time Mandy was clearly delayed. When her brother returned home, he was surprised that Mandy was still not back. He was visiting a friend whose house was located along the road. The brother saw Mandy run back towards home, but after a few minutes, she ran in the opposite direction. He thought she had decided to do another lap, but even considering that, she should have returned home much earlier than him. As time passed, Mandy's relatives began to worry seriously about her. In addition to the fact that she had never run for so long before, she had plans for the evening. Before heading home for the holiday, she invited her dorm mate, who came with her. They were planning to go to a neighboring town that day to meet with friends. 2 hours later, something happened that made the whole family worry even more. Their German Shepherd returned home without Mandy, which was extremely strange. The mother of a young woman who had already lost a child once decided to immediately contact the police, and despite Mandy being 18 years old, the sheriff agreed to start the search right after the woman's call. Meanwhile, the mother began calling literally every resident of the village and asking if they had seen her daughter. Upon hearing that Mandy had disappeared, many of them went out into the street and quickly organized their own search. Together with the young woman's relatives, they walked along the route she had run several times, but she was not found. Meanwhile, the police began questioning people close to Mandy. They learned that the young woman had a boyfriend named Rick, whom she had been dating since high school. The young woman's mother also said that the couple had broken up and gotten back together again. The investigators spoke with him, but found no reason to suspect the young man. They questioned several other people while combing the area with the villagers. By that time, people on SUVs, horses, and helicopters had joined the search. The local dog handler even tried to work with a shepherd dog, hoping that it would lead them to Mandy. However, the dog was clearly frightened and did not want to leave the porch of its house. The search continued until late at night, but it yielded no results. The next day it continued, and the police managed to find the first worrying clue. Volunteers found women's sports pants on one of the back roads. They were covered in mud, looked old, and had several holes. The pants were immediately shown to Mandy's mother, but she hesitated to say that they belonged to her daughter. Despite this, the police still sent them to the laboratory. Experts found traces of male semen on them. Detectives immediately asked for DNA samples from all the men who were familiar with Mandy and were in the area, but no matches were found. The FBI's general database, which contains DNA of convicted criminals, did not exist yet that year, so investigators could not do anything with this clue. Meanwhile, specialists with search dogs began to participate in the search, and soon they discovered a new lead. They managed to find traces of the young woman on the dirt road, as well as the tracks of her sheepdog. But there was one strange moment. Their tracks stopped at the same place. From this, only one conclusion could be drawn. Mandy must have gotten into someone's car. Detectives suggested that she may have been abducted and forced into a car, but experts disproved this assumption, as there would have been a different scene at the point where the tracks ended, as the young woman should have resisted. In reality, it looked as though she got into the car of her own accord, meaning that the driver could have been someone she knew. On the third day of the search, police, along with firefighters, began searching the nearby river that flowed alongside the road where the young woman was last seen. There, they made a distressing discovery. About 5 kilometers downstream from the village, they noticed a female body in the water. After retrieving it, they immediately realized that it was Mandy, as she was naked except for her socks and sneakers. The police did not see any serious injuries, except for several large scratches on her legs. In connection with this, they began to speculate if the young woman could have drowned. but this version made no sense. Firstly, it was the end of November, and the water in the river was very cold, so Mandy could not have gone into it voluntarily, especially without clothes. In addition, the depth of the river in that place was significantly lower than human height, and the young woman could have stood there safely. Medical experts examined the victim's body and found a head injury, which was most likely caused by a strong blow. However, they determined that this injury could not have been the cause of death. In the end, the experts concluded that the young woman died of suffocation in the water. In other words, she drowned. In addition, the medical experts found evidence of violence against the victim and were able to extract biological material from the perpetrator, as well as detect male DNA under the victim's fingernails. Based on all this, the police developed the most likely version of what happened. Someone kidnapped Mandy on the road, dragged her into a car, and drove her to the river, where an unknown perpetrator subjected her to violence. After that, the young woman managed to escape, evidenced by the scratches on her legs, most likely caused by prickly vegetation along the riverbank. At some point, the criminal caught up to Mandy, hit her on the head, and threw her into the water. Forensic experts identified a DNA profile and compared it to samples from everyone who was in any way connected to the case. In total, they checked over 30 men, but no matches were found. Police continued to search for any leads by questioning all residents of the village and surrounding areas. Apart from Mandy's brother, another Acme resident saw her on the day of her disappearance. The man parked near his house and saw the young woman running along the road. When she disappeared from view, a dark pickup truck drove past. At that moment, the man did not attach any importance to it, but after Mandy's murder, he shared his observation with the police. He could not remember the model of the pickup truck and refused to provide detectives with his DNA sample. This behavior seemed suspicious, and they obtained a court order to compel the man to give his DNA. However, it did not match the sample found on the victim's body. The murder received active media coverage, and in the first 3 months, police received several thousand tips. Unfortunately, they all led to dead ends, and as a result, the investigation dragged on for years. Detectives were unable to identify any serious suspects, although they continued to actively consider various candidates. At some point, investigators speculated that an unknown serial killer known as the Green River Killer might be behind the crime. He was suspected of killing dozens of young women, and he often dumped their bodies in rivers. However, no evidence in favor of this version was found. Even when the killer was caught and his identity became known, investigators could not link him to Mandy's murder. Due to the lack of evidence and new suspects, the investigation of this case stopped for many years. Periodically, detectives retrieved it from the archives, trying to find some fresh ideas, but it did not produce any results. In 2009, 20 years after Mandy's death, a new detective from the local police department reopened the investigation. Given that no new evidence had emerged over the past 2 decades, he decided to take a different approach. Together with his colleagues, they went around the entire village and surrounding areas, asking every male resident to provide their DNA sample. The detective's plan was quite simple. He understood that the killer of Mandy was most likely a local resident, and if they collected DNA samples from literally every man, there was a decent chance of finding the culprit among them. Considering that there were only a few hundred men living in the village and its surroundings, this task seemed quite straightforward. But in practice, it turned out to be much more difficult. It took the police a whole 4 years to check all the men, and in the end, they didn't get a single match. The detectives realized that in 20 years since the murder, the killer could have moved somewhere else or even died. So they began to dig through archives and try to track down literally every man who lived in the area at the time of 1989. In 2013, the police received an unexpected lead. Two women who grew up in the same village as Mandy went to a water park with their children. As they chatted, they remembered the infamous murder and began to discuss it. At some point, one of the women said that she suspected who might have killed Mandy. The other replied that she also suspected a specific person. And they both named the same name, Timothy Bass. At the time of the murder, he was 21 years old and lived just a few houses away from the victim. The women were shocked that they had been suspecting the same person all this time. But even more interesting were the reasons why they considered Timothy to be the culprit. One of the women said that Timothy had been hitting on her when they were teenagers. Once, when she was in a car with Timothy and some other friends, he began to aggressively pursue her and make advances. The other friends intervened, and since then, the woman had been seriously afraid of being near this person. The second woman's story was even more shocking. Several years after Mandy's murder, when the woman was already living with her husband and their newborn baby, Timothy knocked on her door one evening while her husband was at work. The woman was not surprised by his visit since he and her husband were friends. Timothy said that he had been passing by after hunting and needed to use the phone. The woman let him in, but Timothy started to behave strangely. Instead of making a call, he stood there with the phone in his hand and then put it down. He then began to tell the woman that he had been in love with her for a long time and offered to engage in a sexual relationship. She refused and demanded that he leave, but Timothy continued to insist, aggressively. The woman then threatened to call the police, and only after that did he leave their home. Sharing these stories, they decided to go to the police together and talk about their suspicions about Timothy. When asked why they waited so long, the women replied that they were not sure of his involvement in the murder. In such a small community, they would never be forgiven if they accused an innocent person of murder, so none of them dared to share this information. Detectives immediately became interested in this person and noticed something interesting. During the initial investigation, none of their colleagues interviewed Timothy or asked him to provide a DNA sample. This was very strange. The young man did not appear in old police reports despite being acquainted with the victim, living nearby, and his house being next to the same road that the young woman ran on. Digging deeper, investigators also found that Mandy was friends with his younger brother, Tom. Another suspicious moment was that Timothy moved to another city less than 2 months after the murder. Perhaps this was the reason why the guy remained out of the police's sight. At that time, they were busy with a huge amount of leads and checking people who voluntarily cooperated with them. Timothy settled in the town of Emerson, located 40 kilometers from his old home. Shortly before moving, he married and eventually had 3 children. Opening his criminal history, detectives found another alarming fact. In 2010, his wife filed a statement with the police that Timothy had beaten her and their children, but the investigators were most surprised by one small detail contained in this statement. In it, his wife described why Timothy was a danger to their family. Among the stories of domestic violence, she briefly mentioned her husband's strange behavior. While watching documentary crime films, when they watched similar programs together, Timothy constantly criticized criminals for how poorly they commit murders, leaving behind a lot of evidence. The man also loved to say that he would never make the same mistakes and would not have been caught. After studying all this information, the detectives began to seriously consider his involvement in Mandy's murder. They went to his house to ask a series of questions and request a voluntary DNA sample. And that's when the most interesting part began. Timothy claimed that he did not remember the crime and could not even remember who Mandy Stavik was. This statement immediately made detectives doubt his words. First of all the residents of the village, with a population of less than 300, knew each other. Secondly, Timothy lived just a few houses away from the Stavik family, and it was simply impossible to imagine that he did not know her. Moreover, after the murder, this case was talked about not only in the village itself, but also in all neighboring towns. It was the first such crime in the area in many years, and for local residents, this topic remained number one for many months. Therefore, detectives did not hurry to believe the man's words, and they asked him to provide a DNA sample. But Timothy refused, which aroused even more suspicion. Unfortunately, they had absolutely no evidence that could link him to the murder, so investigators could not obtain a court order that would require the man to provide his DNA. Then, they decided to go another way. Detectives found out that Timothy had worked as a courier at a bakery located in a neighboring town for many years. They went there and talked to the manager, asking him to provide them with information about Timothy's routes for the next few days. The police planned to track him and get some item on which the man could leave his DNA. They did not tell the manager which particular crime their employee was suspected of. Detectives only said that an investigation was underway, but the woman refused to provide this information without the permission of higher management. The police contacted them and they demanded a court order. Thus, investigators were again at a dead end. They continued to study Timothy's biography and try to find new clues that would allow them to obtain the much-needed court decision. But all their attempts led to nothing, and the case was stalled for several more years. In 2015, the police came to his house again, asked a few questions, and requested a DNA sample. But he refused again. It continued until 2017, when something unexpected happened. A woman named Kim Wagner, who was a manager at the bakery, went to a bar with her husband and friends, all of whom used to live in Acme and were around the same age as Mandy when she was murdered. At some point, they started talking about the case, which had haunted the locals for decades. Suddenly, one of the friends mentioned Timothy Bass, who lived near the victim's home, and it dawned on Kim when the police came to her workplace and asked for information about his whereabouts. She didn't even think it could be related to Mandy Stavik's murder. And then Kim started thinking that her colleague was the killer. This thought stayed with her for a long time. At some point, detectives came to her workplace again, hoping that she had changed her position since their previous conversation, and their hope was justified. Kim invited the investigators to her office and asked directly, "Do they suspect Timothy of killing Mandy?" The police were surprised but did not deny it, and then the woman provided them with all the necessary information and interesting observations about her colleague. She had known the man for many years and always found him strange. When one of her friends mentioned that Bass lived near Mandy's home during those years, she began to seriously consider his involvement in the case, so she decided to help the investigators. The detectives started following Timothy, and new difficulties emerged. He always wore gloves at work, which prevented experts from taking a DNA sample from objects he touched. The man also did not smoke, so the police could not even obtain a cigarette butt with his saliva. Bass did not even have a workplace in the bakery since he worked exclusively on delivering products. In addition, another strange fact complicated the investigator's task. Timothy never threw away his garbage at work. he stored it in his van and took it home. The detectives immediately realized that such behavior could not be a coincidence. Apparently, Timothy understood that the police suspected him of Mandy's murder and started making sure that they did not get any items with his DNA. But in the end, the detectives were lucky to find out that they couldn't obtain the suspect's biological material. Kim offered to help. Laws work in such a way that police officers are not allowed to ask third parties to obtain evidence for them. In such a case, the evidence will not be admissible in court, even if the suspect's guilt is obvious. However, if any person voluntarily hands over evidence to the investigators, they have the right to accept and use it. Thus, Kim offered to obtain some DNA samples from Bass, and the detectives waited. The suspect was very careful, and it took the woman a long time to achieve her goal. Only after 3 months did she see the man drink Coke from a plastic cup and then throw it away in the trash with the can. Kim waited until Timothy left, took both pieces of evidence, and handed them over to the police. They immediately sent the can with the cup to the laboratory, and the experts extracted a DNA profile from them. It fully matched the biological material found on Mandy's body. Having finally obtained the long-awaited evidence, the police immediately went after the man and arrested him. 28 years after the murder, the suspect was finally charged. During the interrogation, Timothy denied his guilt until the investigators told him about the DNA sample match. Hearing this, the man immediately changed his story and said that he and Mandy had a secret affair. They supposedly started dating many months before her murder and had to hide their relationship from everyone because she had a boyfriend. According to Timothy, on the day of her death, Mandy came to his house during her jog. They had an intimate encounter, and she left. He added that his father was at home at the time, but it was impossible to use him as a witness since he had passed away long ago. The detectives did not believe this story for a second. In their opinion, Timothy made up the whole story about the secret affair just to explain the presence of his DNA on the victim's body. Moreover, as proof of his words, he referred to his deceased father, who could not refute this information. Investigators talked to Mandy's relatives and friends, and they all expressed complete confidence that the young woman would never date Timothy. He was very strange, avoided communication with other people, and spent most of his time alone. The detectives decided to speak with Timothy's wife. Despite the fact that the woman had filed statements against her husband and lived separately, they were still married. Here, the police were waiting for another interesting turn. The woman suddenly said that on the day of Mandy's murder, she was with Timothy at his house and he was there all day. The detectives did not believe her story, but her words created possible difficulties for the court. On the other hand, they contradicted Timothy's version, according to which Mandy came to his house on the day of the murder and had an intimate relationship with him. The trial began in May 2019. Timothy's lawyer continued to insist that his client was innocent and that his DNA got on the victim's body as a result of a consensual intimate contact. The prosecution, however, insisted that there was no evidence to support this version. Timothy never called Mandy, never wrote her notes or letters, and no one among the witnesses saw them together. It was much more likely that Bass had a one-sided crush on the young woman and was even obsessed with her. Investigators found out that the guy started attending all the sports matches when Mandy joined the school team. Before that, he had absolutely no interest in sports. In addition, his windows overlooked the road where the young woman was running, and he could watch her during her runs. Apparently, that day, he decided to talk to her and caught up with her. Perhaps the guy started to harass Mandy, but the young woman resisted, or he persuaded her to get into his car on some pretext. Later, Bass took her to a deserted place, subjected her to violence, and then the young woman managed to escape. The guy caught up with her near the riverbank, hit her on the head with some object, and threw her body into the water. Timothy's wife testified as a witness in court, who by that time had already divorced him, and this time she surprised everyone again. Instead of sticking to her original story, the woman told a new one. According to her, she did not remember that she was at Timothy's house on the day of the murder. The woman added that Bass had forced her to lie to the police during the first interrogation, otherwise he could go to jail. At that time, she seriously feared that her husband might harm her or her children, so she agreed to lie to the police. This deprived the suspect of his only alibi, but the court heard even more interesting details. Tom's younger brother told that after Timothy was asked for a DNA sample, he started to get very anxious about it. When Tom asked him what was going on, his brother told him the same story about a secret affair with the victim. Timothy also asked him to tell the police that he had also had a sexual relationship with Mandy, but Tom refused to lie. Even Timothy's own mother testified against him when she visited him in jail, and he passed her a note asking her to lie to the police that they had gone to the store together on the day of the murder to buy Christmas gifts, but she refused to lie. In the note, Timothy also asked her to testify against his own father and try to convince investigators that he was the real killer. After all this, the defendant's lawyer tried to convince the jurors that Timothy's DNA sample had been obtained illegally. He insisted that the police had asked a civilian to obtain the man's biological material outside the rules. However, Kim Wagner refuted these claims and said that she had offered her help to the police. In 1989, this murder deeply shook her, and she continued to think about it regularly for decades. Learning that her colleague was a suspect, she wanted to help solve the case. Moreover, by that time, she already had a daughter, and Kim could barely imagine what Mandy's mother felt during those years. The trial lasted several weeks, and after all the evidence presented, the jury found Timothy Bass guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison, with the possibility of applying for early release after 24 years. Mandy's mother, who was 83 years old at the time, thanked the detectives for their work. Although she had lost 2 children in her life, she was still glad that the guilty party had been punished. In 1990, Mandy's relatives established a scholarship in her name at the high school where she attended. They continue to support this program to this day, annually awarding the most talented students who study music. The foundation of this scholarship was $25,000 collected by the residents of Acme and other towns. Initially, this money was offered as a reward for information, but after the case was solved, it was decided to put it into this program. Marlene Warren was born on April 15, 1950, in Michigan, USA. She grew up without a father, and since her teenage years, dreamed of having a large and close-knit family. Very soon, that dream came true. The girl married a man named John, and they had 2 sons. But just a few years later, an unexpected tragedy struck the family. Marlene's husband died suddenly of an illness, and the woman was left alone with 2 small children. Since then, she has spent most of her time at work, trying to provide for her sons alone. Although she struggled with this, she sacrificed everything for her children. 6 years after her husband's death, she met a man named Michael Warren, and they soon married. The man was a used car salesman, and after their marriage, he opened his own business in that area. By that time, Marlene was already making good money, but instead of spending all her money, she tried to save it. The woman invested in Michael's company and also helped him in the management. The man himself was also good at this business, and in the following years, it began to bring them decent money. Over time, Marlene and her husband expanded the business. They bought several properties to rent, and their finances took off. The family moved to an upscale Miami suburb called Wellington, buying a large house there. They seemed to have built a near-perfect life. But in 1988, Marlene suffered another tragedy. Her oldest son was killed in a car accident.
For the woman and her youngest son, Joseph, it was a huge blow. After all the difficulties they had gone through, their life had just got better when suddenly fate presented them with yet another test. Yet they found the strength to move on. After this tragedy, Marlene became even closer
to Joseph because he was her only closest relative. Her husband also helped her to recover from this loss. After the death of her son, the woman began to think about selling the properties that she and Michael were renting out. Despite the fact that this business brought in good money, for Marlene it was associated with constant worries. There were often situations when tenants delayed rent or lost income altogether. In each such case, the woman did her best to find the best solution. It was very hard for her to put people on the street because she was a good-natured person and well remembered the financial difficulties she experienced with 2 small children. On the other hand, she and her husband could not let people live in their homes for free, and eventually, Marlene wanted to get rid of the business so that she would no longer face such moral dilemmas. 2 years had passed since her son's death. The family was just beginning to recover and return to normalcy. But something terrible and unforeseen awaited them once again. On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene was at home with her son and 3 of his friends who came over for breakfast. Their kitchen was located so that they could see the driveway through the windows. At some point, the doorbell rang and Marlene went to open it. Her son saw a white Chrysler parked in front of their house. The next second, the woman opened the front door and saw a man in a clown costume holding 2 balloons and a bouquet of flowers on the doorstep. Marlene said, "How cute is that?" But the next second, something unexpected happened. The clown pulled a gun out of his pocket and shot the woman in the head. Her son and his friends rushed into the hallway where a heartbreaking sight awaited them. Marlene was lying on the floor with blood everywhere. The man in the clown suit looked at them for a few seconds, then got back into his car and drove away. My son called an ambulance, after which he decided to chase after his attacker. At the time, his leg was in a cast after an injury and the guy couldn't drive. He told his 2 friends to stay with his mother, asked his friend to drive, and drove with her in the direction the attacker had gone. But by that time, the clown was out of sight and they never managed to find him. Marlene was taken to the hospital in an unconscious state, and the detectives began their investigation. The first thing they did was talk to everyone in the house. The woman's son said that he could not see any signs of his attacker. He was wearing a suit and makeup. He was wearing gloves on his hands and a wig on his head. The only thing the son remembered was that the perpetrator had very dark eyes. His friends added that the clown was quite tall, and his shoes stood out strongly against the costume. They looked like work shoes. A neighbor who was walking his dog near Marlene's house also saw the clown, but he was unable to share any significant sightings with police. Investigators put out a search for a white Chrysler and began searching for other evidence. Of course, Marlene's husband, Michael, was the first to be suspected. That morning, he had just left for the racing stadium in Miami, and at the time of the attack on his wife, he was not at home. From the first hours of the investigation, the police had several good reasons to think about his involvement. First, they found out that Marlene and her relatives really liked clowns. There were a lot of pictures and figures depicting these characters in their house. This suggested that the attacker knew this fact and chose such an outfit for a reason. Secondly, just 2 hours after the incident, the police received an anonymous tip from a woman who called the investigators and said they should look into Michael Warren and a woman named Sheila Keene. Sheila, who was 26, worked with Michael at his car rental company. Digging deeper, the detectives learned of rumors that there was a secret affair between them. Their relationship had been speculated about by some colleagues, so they immediately shared this information with investigators. Here, the police discovered another possible motive. If Michael was in a relationship with another woman and wanted to break up with Marlene, he had one problem. Most of the real estate and business that the family owned were written down to his wife. In that case, Michael would lose an impressive part of his fortune in a divorce. The police immediately checked the man's whereabouts at the time of the attack, and it turned out that Michael was in a car about 110 kilometers away from the house and had 2 friends with him. Investigators concluded he would not have been physically capable of committing the crime. Upon learning of the attempt on his wife's life, Michael rushed to the hospital and has not left her room since. Officers spoke with Sheila, and she stated that there was no romantic relationship between them and she had nothing to do with the crime. The woman added that she was at work at the time. Detectives also interviewed Sheila's husband, who said he was aware of rumors of an affair between his wife and Michael, but could not confirm whether or not it was true. The man added that his wife had moved out about a month ago, and in fact, they were no longer together. Although the police had no evidence to link Michael and Sheila to the crime, they continued to consider their involvement highly probable. Given that the husband could not have physically been outside his house that morning, the police wondered, could Sheila have been the clown? Because of the costume, none of the witnesses could determine the gender of the assailant for certain, and Sheila was known among her colleagues for her character. The woman was responsible for dealing with clients who were delinquent in their rent payments. In most of these cases, she had to take the car away from them, and in this, Sheila was adamant. Some of these cases led to serious conflicts, so the woman always carried a gun with her. After doctors removed the bullet from Marlene's head, experts determined that it had been fired from a .38 caliber handgun, remarkably the same caliber as Sheila's. The cops went to her again to examine the weapon, but the woman said the gun had been stolen or lost months before the incident, and the detectives were again left with nothing. The cops continued to dig deeper and learned that after Sheila moved out of her husband's house, she had moved into a rental apartment, and investigators also heard rumors that Michael was paying for the place. Here, a new interesting discovery awaited the police officers. All the while, their colleagues were trying to establish where the perpetrator took the clown costume, balloons, and flowers. At first glance, it seemed a very difficult task, but the detectives were lucky they found that on May 24th, 2 days before the attempt on Marlene's life, a woman came to the costume store near Sheila's apartment. The employee said that at the time, the store was closed and they were about to leave, but the woman persistently knocked on the door until someone opened it for her. She stated that she urgently needed a clown costume, a wig, face makeup, and a red nose. The clerks tried to explain to her that the store was already closed and asked her to come back tomorrow, but the woman was adamant, so the staff still sold her the items. There were no surveillance cameras in the store, so the police officers had to rely on verbal description of the woman's appearance. The salespeople told them that she was tall and thin with dark hair. Detectives showed them pictures of several women, and the officers said the customer looked like one of them, Sheila. As for the balloons and flowers, they were traced to a supermarket about a mile from Sheila's apartment. The salesman stated that the same items had been bought by a woman just a few hours before the attempt on Marlene's life. He described her exactly like the costume store employees, a tall, thin young woman with long dark hair. The salesman added another interesting fact. According to him, the female customer exhibited rude and to some extent even masculine manners. By that time, the investigation had lasted 2 days, and on May 28th, the doctors told the police that Marlene had died. Despite their best efforts, the effects of the point-blank shot were too severe. As a result, the case was reclassified as a homicide, and detectives continued to look for more possible evidence against Sheila. They asked the judge for a warrant to search her apartment. While the police were waiting, something else happened. They were informed of a similar car in a parking lot located 13 kilometers from the victim's home. Investigators got there and quickly verified that it was the same Chrysler the killer was driving. Inside, they found some long dark hair and orange fibers that looked like pieces of a clown wig. During a search of Sheila's apartment, the police found the exact same orange-colored particles, and they also found work boots that matched the witness's description, a similar model worn by the clown on the day of the murder. Despite all this, the police had one major problem. DNA analysis was barely used at the time, and without it, all this evidence was circumstantial. A high probability the court would have acquitted Sheila, in which case it would be impossible to charge her again with murder. Then the detectives wondered, where did the car the clown drove to Marlene's house come from? And then they found out something very interesting. An employee of Michael's company told them that 1.5 months before Marlene's murder, they had received a call from a man to rent a rental car. But there was one problem. This man had mixed up the phone numbers and he had taken the car from another company, the main competitors of Michael. When the employee told the boss about it, Michael behaved very strangely. Instead of telling the customer about his mistake, he told the man to just bring the car to the parking lot and leave the keys in the cabin. Then Michael asked the employee to bring him and Sheila to the parking lot and never to tell anyone about what had happened. The employee watched as they got into that car and drove away. It was the same white Chrysler. Notably, not long before that, there had been a serious disagreement between Michael and his competitors. The problem was that Michael was portraying his competitors in a bad light in his advertising, and they didn't like their brand being portrayed in a negative light. Detectives decided to look into Michael's business in more detail. During the audit, they found numerous violations of the law, including tax and insurance manipulation. Moreover, they found evidence that Michael sometimes resorted to illegal methods of returning cars, even when customers paid on time and did not violate any terms. During this audit, the police also spoke to an employee who recalled something interesting. According to him, Michael and Marlene once had an argument in the workplace. When the woman left, Michael asked the employee, "How much would you charge to make my wife disappear?" Although it all sounded highly suspicious, detectives still had no evidence linking Michael to the murder. He was nevertheless arrested for various business manipulations. The court initially sentenced the man to 8 years in prison, but he was released after 4 years. Later, in 2002, Michael married Sheila and they moved to another state. Even though the detectives were never able to prove their involvement in the murder, they continued to watch them. The cops discovered that after the move, Sheila began introducing herself to everyone she knew under a different name, Debbie, and that she had dyed her hair from dark to blonde. She and Michael opened their restaurant, and it seemed that they had managed to build a wonderful life in the new place. However, soon rumors began to circulate among the employees of their establishment that Sheila had murdered Michael's ex-wife. Apparently, one of them stumbled across information about this crime and learned that the police still suspected them. However, detectives still could not prove their guilt, and the case finally froze. It wasn't reopened until 2013, and a new team of investigators requested a re-examination of all available evidence. By then, technology in the examination of DNA and other physical evidence had advanced to a new level compared to 1990. It took several years to examine the evidence. First, experts compared the orange flecks found in Sheila's apartment, the car, and the murder scene, and analysis showed they were identical. But the biggest clue was waiting ahead. Experts took a DNA sample from several hairs found in the white Chrysler and compared them to Sheila's DNA. They were a perfect match. Detectives thus obtained incontrovertible evidence that Sheila was in the very car in which the clown drove up to Marlene's house, enough to take the case to court. And the woman was arrested in 2017. At the time, Sheila was 54 and still denied guilt. She was denied the right to bail and awaited trial in a cell. As for Michael, he insisted that he had nothing to do with Marlene's murder and believed that Sheila had nothing to do with it either. He hired expensive attorneys for her, and the wait for the trial stretched on for years. In preparation for it, the police uncovered some facts not previously known. It turned out that a year after the murder, they were approached by a lawyer who had worked with Michael on his business. He said that about a year before the murder, Michael had asked him an extremely odd question. If the husband kills his wife, what happens to the property recorded in her name? Will the husband get it? The lawyer was surprised by such a question, but that didn't stop him from actually giving Michael advice. He said that if the husband asked his acquaintance to commit this murder and the court could not tie the husband to the man, he would get all his wife's property. But the lawyer went on to say something that later shocked investigators. He told Michael that if the killer wore some sort of costume, such as a clown, he would never be identified and would escape punishment. Another shocking confession came from a man whose father worked for Michael at the time of the murder. He confessed that his now-deceased father had helped to run illegal schemes at extra cost, such as swiping mileage meters to sell cars at a higher price. But on the day of the murder, Michael asked him to do something far more terrible. He told the man to get rid of the gun and of the car. Apparently, the car in question was the one in which the killer moved after he abandoned the Chrysler in the parking lot, and the employee complied with these requests. Before he died, he told all this to his son and added another important detail. The man said that the second car was hidden in the river canal. As soon as the police received this information from his son, they combed the canal and indeed found the car there. Unfortunately, no evidence of it survived, but the very fact that it was there confirmed that the witness was telling the truth. The beginning of Sheila's trial was repeatedly postponed until finally a final date was set for May 12, 2023. But on April 25th, something unexpected happened. The woman pleaded guilty in exchange for not receiving the death penalty, which she would face if she were to lose her murder trial. Her attorneys explained the situation as follows. Sheila is innocent of the murder, but she fears for her life, which is why she took responsibility for someone else's crime. However, there is a much more logical explanation. Under the terms of the deal, she pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree, which implies a sentence of 12 years in prison, which is exactly the sentence she received. But furthermore interesting, the court deducted from that term the time the woman spent behind bars since her arrest, about 5.5 years. But that is not all. The judge reduced the remaining term due to the good behavior of Sheila. As a result, the woman was to spend between 16 and 24 months in prison. Her attorneys assured her that they could secure her release after the minimum bar of that time expired. So, Sheila was found guilty of murdering a woman in cold blood in front of her son and received a frankly ludicrous sentence for it. As for Michael, his involvement is still unproven and he remains free. Most likely he will never be charged again for the murder of his wife because there is not a single piece of evidence against him. Despite all this, the son of Marlene thanked the detectives who were able to get to the truth and did not give up on the case for many years. The death of his mother was the strongest tragedy for him because she was his only relative. Nevertheless, he was able to cope with the pain, opened his own small construction firm, and got his life together. Donna Brown was born on November 10, 1963 in Miami. She grew up in a large and friendly family with two younger sisters whom she had along with very well. When Donna was young, her parents divorced and she remained living with her mother. Despite this, her father remained actively involved in his daughters' lives and they remained quite close. After finishing school, Donna received medical training and became a surgical assistant at a local hospital. Her colleagues quickly grew to love her because she took her work seriously and was also a kind and open person. Her life was going quite well, but Donna wanted to start her own family for complete happiness. In the late 1980s, Donna went on a date with a man named Mark Winger, and she almost immediately knew she had met her match. Mark was charming and intelligent, worked as a nuclear engineer, and dreamed of having a large family. They began dating and decided to get married in 1989. Shortly after that, Mark received a job offer at a nuclear facility in Springfield, Illinois. It was a big step up the career ladder for him, and he and Donna decided to move there. The couple settled in a nice neighborhood, and soon after the move, Donna got a job at a local hospital. They only lacked children for complete happiness, but all their attempts were unsuccessful. At some point, Donna learned that she was medically unable to conceive, and it was a devastating blow for her. Both she and Mark dreamed of a large family, and all the conditions of their lives were favorable for it, but fate decided otherwise. Then the couple began to consider adoption, but kept postponing this serious step. This continued until 1995, when everything changed in one day. A pregnant underage girl was admitted to the hospital where Donna worked, and she wanted to give her child to a loving family. Mark and Donna immediately decided to adopt the baby. In June, right after the birth, they adopted a girl and named her Bailey Elizabeth Winger. The day they took her home coincided with the anniversary of their engagement. The couple and all the relatives were happy that they finally had a child. In August of the same year, Donna went to Florida with her 3-month-old daughter to visit her parents and introduce them to their granddaughter. The family had a great time, and sometime later, the woman returned home. She flew to the nearest airport, which was 2 hours away from Springfield, and then hired a taxi to her city through a special company. This trip greatly spoiled Donna's mood because the driver behaved quite inadequately. The whole way he talked about how several personalities lived in him and they forced him to do various terrible things, such as killing people. In addition, the driver talked about how he regularly participated in orgies and even invited Donna to participate in them. The man also constantly violated traffic rules and drove the car quite dangerously. When Donna got home, she told her husband about it, and he was furious. Mark called the company the driver worked for and demanded that he be fired. It turned out that the driver was 27-year-old Roger Harrington, and after the complaint, the management decided to suspend him from work. But that wasn't the end of it. During the next week, an unknown man called Winger's home phone, refused to identify himself, and asked for Donna. She and her husband suspected that the caller was Roger, and she was seriously concerned about her safety. Given that the man knew their home address, she was afraid that Roger might harm her. On August 29th, a distress call was made to the Springfield Police Department. Mark Winger was in a panic and reported that an unknown man had broken into their home and attacked Donna with a hammer. Mark, shocked and terrified, took his gun and shot the intruder. When the officers arrived at the scene, they found 2 bodies on the floor with Mark in a state of panic. The police officers detected a faint pulse from both individuals on the floor and called an ambulance while trying to obtain information from Mark about what had happened. Although Mark could barely speak, the detectives managed to piece together a rough idea of what had occurred. Mark explained that he was using the treadmill in the basement when he heard a noise upstairs. He went upstairs to the main floor and found his 3-month-old daughter unattended on the bed. When he went to another room, he saw an unknown man attacking his wife with a hammer. Mark panicked and grabbed his gun, shooting the attacker before calling the police. While waiting for the ambulance, one of the officers found a wallet in the attacker's jacket with documents belonging to a Roger Harrington. The detective knew this person well. Roger lived in a trailer park in Springfield and had a criminal history mostly related to minor offenses. He also had mental health issues and was generally known to be quite aggressive. Both Roger and Donna were taken to the hospital, where they died without regaining consciousness. Meanwhile, the police examined the crime scene, collecting evidence. Next to the bodies was a bloodied hammer, while Mark's gun was found on a table nearby, along with a pack of cigarettes and a paper cup of coffee. Mark told the detectives that the cigarettes and coffee were likely brought by the killer. The hammer was from his tool set, as he was planning to hang some pictures that day, so he prepared it and left it in the living room. Near the Wingers' home, Roger's car was found, and detectives discovered a note inside. It contained Donna's home address, Mark's name, and the time, 4:30 p.m. When asked if he knew the attacker, Mark initially denied it, but when the police mentioned Roger's name, Mark realized with horror that the driver was the same person. He told the detectives the story of how they knew Roger, his strange behavior towards Donna, and the creepy calls to their home number. The investigator spoke with acquaintances and relatives of Donna who were aware of her fears. She had repeatedly complained to them that she was seriously concerned about Roger and was afraid that he might come to her house one day and seek revenge because he lost his job after she complained to their superiors. Donna even wrote down all the details of her trip with Roger on a piece of paper in case she had to go to the police. The police found this paper at their house, and the investigation lasted for 2 days before the case was closed. No charges were brought against Mark for shooting Roger because his actions were classified as self-defense. He continued to be in a state of shock, and his relatives flew to Springfield to support him and help take care of his daughter. Donna's relatives also provided him with all kinds of assistance. Months went by, and Mark continued to struggle with the loss of his wife and his family began to notice negative changes in his behavior. He began drinking heavily, although he had never consumed alcohol before these events. He also often visited local bars. His relatives tried to support him in every way possible and help take care of Bailey, but ultimately they had to return to their own cities. Donna's parents understood that it would be difficult for Mark to take care of his daughter, so they suggested finding a nanny. In the end, Mark hired a woman named Rebecca Handed, who specialized in round-the-clock childcare, so she spent most of her time at their house. Rebecca took care of the girl and got along great with her. Mark gradually began to recover, stopped drinking, and returned to work. This went on for several months, and during this time, a romance developed between him and Rebecca. She hardly ever left his house, and they spent time together with Bailey, constantly communicating, and eventually, this led to mutual sympathy. Rebecca also sincerely loved the girl, and a strong bond was formed between them. In 1996, a woman became pregnant, and Mark was given another chance to start a big and strong family. Rebecca also wanted this, and the couple got married in October. Mark and Donna's relatives were surprised that he started a new relationship just a few months after his wife's death, but ultimately supported him, as the new family was beneficial not only to him, but also to Bailey. All the relatives sympathized with Rebecca, seeing her sincere love and care for the girl. Mark decided to sell his house because it constantly reminded him of Donna's death, and after what had happened, he did not want to raise children there. He and Rebecca decided to buy a house with a large plot of land outside the city, renovated it, and started to build their new life. Soon they had a daughter, and over the next few years, they had another daughter and a son. Thus, Mark and Rebecca raised 4 children, and the man's dream of a large family came true. Over time, Mark became more distant from Donna's relatives, who tried to be present in their granddaughter's life. The problem was that Bailey didn't remember Donna at all and considered Rebecca her mother. Mark didn't want the girl to know about the tragic past of their family from an early age, and ultimately, he forbade Donna's parents from calling her their granddaughter. They tried to persuade him, but in the end, they gave up all attempts. The relatives understood that it might be better for the girl to grow up away from what had happened. In the following years, Mark and Rebecca happily lived in their new home, raised their children, and made plans for the future. The tragedy of the past gradually faded, but its echoes continued to haunt the family. In 1999, Mark decided to sue the company that hired Roger Harrington as a driver. In Mark's opinion, this company did not make any effort to check this person's sanity, and as a result, it led to the murder of his wife. The company did not want to admit its guilt, and Mark hired a lawyer. To determine their guilt, the court decided to study all the materials of the case and the evidence, which were handed over to the lawyers. While they were preparing for the trial, something completely unexpected happened. In February of the same year, a woman named Deanne Schultz came to the police and told detectives a shocking story. Deanne was Donna's best friend and worked with her at the hospital. When Donna had a child, Deanne actively helped her take care of the girl. But Deanne's story turned everything upside down. She confessed to the police that she had been having an affair with Mark for several months, which they had kept hidden from their spouses. It all started 3 months before Donna's death. Around the same time, the couple adopted a daughter. Mark and Deanne were secretly seeing each other, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. The woman told detectives that Mark wanted to get rid of his wife to be with her. One day, he said, it would be so much easier if Donna just died. He then began to persuade Deanne to help him with a plan, but he did not reveal the details. Mark said that all Deanne needed to do was go to their house, find his wife's body, and call the police. The woman thought Mark couldn't be serious and was just joking, but he continued to share troubling things with her.
After Donna complained to him about Roger Harrington's behavior, he told Deanne about it and said he had planned to frame the driver. He added that he just needed to figure out how to lure him into the house. A week before the murder, he called Deanne and asked if she would still love him no matter what, to which she answered,
Yes. A few days after Donna's murder, friends and family gathered at their house to support Mark. When he was alone with Deanne, he said, "It seems like the police believe me. I did it for us." The woman was shocked, but Mark demanded that she not tell anyone, and she obeyed. They continued to secretly see each other and even exchanged rings, planning to get married in the foreseeable future. But in the following months, Mark started a romantic relationship with the nanny and eventually broke up with Deanne. She was devastated. She had kept this terrible secret from Mark, and he had traded her for someone else. Deanne never dared to tell the police about everything, realizing that part of the blame was on her. Over the next few years, the woman repeatedly tried to take her own life, and only after 3.5 years did she finally overcome herself and go to the police station. The detectives were completely shocked. All this time, Mark had been considered a victim and even a hero who tried to save his beloved wife from a terrible killer. But Deanne's story changed everything, and the police looked at the case from a completely different angle. The investigators decided to re-examine the evidence, but they were met with an unpleasant surprise. All of it had been handed over to lawyers who were preparing Mark's case against the transportation company. It would take time to retrieve them, but some materials from the case remained at the station. The photographs from the crime scene. The lead detective looked at them and realized with horror that they had missed some obvious things all these years. The investigation had been quickly closed after the murder, as no one doubted Roger's guilt. But now, as the detectives held these photos for the first time, he realized that the positioning of the bodies did not match Mark's story at all. He had told them that when he entered the room, Donna was lying on the floor and the perpetrator was striking her with a hammer from above, and then he shot him and Roger fell next to the woman. In reality, however, his body was lying in the opposite direction, and he physically could not have fallen in that direction. The detective realized that Mark's story was a lie, and it made him rethink a whole series of moments that now made much more sense. First of all, no one ever figured out how Roger got into the house. There were no signs of a break-in, and Donna certainly would not have opened the door for him. But if you remember the note inside Roger's car, everything falls into place. It had Mark's name and the time, which looked like a reminder of a meeting. Remembering Deanne's story, the detective concluded that Mark had somehow invited Roger to their home on some pretext and let him in, after which he shot him. Secondly, in Roger's car, they found a knife and several other items that he could have used for the murder, but he did not take them with him and used Mark's hammer, which the man took out of the closet on that very day and left in plain sight. All of this sounded completely illogical if you assume that Roger came to the house to kill someone. Moreover, he left a pack of cigarettes and a paper cup of coffee on their table, a very strange thing for a person who came there to kill. The detective listened to the recording of the 911 call made by Mark and was once again shocked. Mark told the operator that he had shot the attacker once, after which there was a male mumble in the background, as if someone was trying to speak. Mark told the operator that his daughter was crying and he needed to go to her, after which he hung up. However, there was no hint of a child's crying on the recording. A more realistic scenario was that Mark did not shoot Roger once, and on hearing the gunshot, Donna ran to him and her husband hit her with a hammer. After that, he called the police and pretended to be panicked, reporting what had happened. Suddenly, Roger woke up and tried to say something, and those sounds were recorded on the call. Mark lied about his daughter crying, hung up, and shot Roger again. In support of this version, there was another fact that the investigators completely ignored. Mark and Donna's neighbors said during the questioning that they heard 2 shots. However, about 5 minutes had passed between them, which did not fit with Mark's story, but completely matched the more realistic version in which he was the killer. But that wasn't all. During the initial investigation, which lasted only 2 days, the experts did not even examine the evidence. However, now that Mark decided to sue the transportation company, they hired lawyers and were going to win this case. The lawyers requested an independent examination of the clothing of all 3 participants in those events. The results spoke for itself. Blood spatters and traces indicated that Mark's story had nothing to do with reality. According to him, Roger was hitting Donna with a hammer, but there was not a drop of her blood on his clothes, not even the smallest, while there was plenty of blood from his wife on Mark's clothes, which directly indicated that he had killed his wife. The police took the evidence from the lawyers and conducted their own analysis, which showed exactly the same result. In the end, the police reopened the investigation, but this time it was about a double murder in which Mark became a suspect. His family was in shock. No one believed that the man was capable of such a brutal crime. Donna's relatives were skeptical of the suspicions against Mark until they heard all the information that the detectives had uncovered. The only ones who insisted on Roger's innocence from the first day were his friends and family members. They were all aware of his minor criminal history, but did not believe he was capable of murder. Moreover, their neighbor Roger, with whom they shared a rental, initially gave the police important information that they overlooked. Immediately after the murder, the detectives questioned the man, and he told them that the day before, Roger received a call, hung up, and wrote down Mark Winger's name, address, and time on a piece of paper. It all looked as if Mark had scheduled a meeting with him, but the police did not attach much importance to it. Rebecca experienced the greatest shock from the whole situation. She knew Mark as a loving and caring father who had never shown any aggression during their time together. She refused to believe that this person could beat his wife with a hammer and frame someone else. After several weeks of investigation, the police decided to arrest Mark, and he was arrested right at work. The case was sent to court. Mark was granted a $1 million bail. He could not raise that amount, so he remained in custody awaiting trial. The trial did not begin until 3 years later, in May 2002. All his close ones and even Donna's relatives hoped that this would be a big misunderstanding and that the court would prove Mark's innocence. None of them were prepared for the opposite, and his lawyers insisted on the truthfulness of Mark's version. They noted that the crime scene photos could have been taken after the medics moved Roger's body, considering that the doctor's actions were not documented. It was possible to prove or disprove this possibility. In addition, the lawyers emphasized Roger's criminal history, his mental problems, and his inappropriate behavior with Donna during the trip. Deanne Schultz became the main witness in this case. By law, she could have been punished for keeping Mark's secret all these years, but the judge decided to grant her full immunity in exchange for her testimony. The male lawyers tried to discredit Deanne in every possible way, pointing out that she had attempted suicide multiple times, which could indicate psychological problems. The defense also suggested that she had made it all up out of jealousy, seeking revenge on Mark. The prosecution insisted that the evidence and Deanne's testimony unequivocally pointed to his guilt. As for motive, it lay in the mistress's story. Mark lost interest in Donna long before they adopted Bailey. He'd been having secret affairs with her best friend, but he could not divorce Donna because he would have to split their expensive home and other assets, which was unacceptable to him. After Roger gave Donna a ride from the airport, Mark saw the perfect opportunity and decided to act. As terrible as it sounds, Mark was lucky. He encountered a man with a criminal record and mental illness who claimed to hear voices telling him to kill people. After Roger complained to management, he lost his job, which became the perfect motive when both the prosecution and defense laid their cards on the table, leaving only the jury's decision to wait for. Despite the compelling evidence against Mark, there were still doubts about his guilt among both his family members and Donna's relatives. None of them could imagine a loving father and respected member of society as a killer. Nevertheless, the jury unanimously found him guilty of the double murder. In the end, Mark received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and Roger was posthumously exonerated. Rebecca could not believe that her husband had actually killed Donna. It took her a long time to impartially consider all the evidence of his guilt until she finally came to terms with the fact that he was truly a murderer. The chief detectives apologized repeatedly to Donna's and Roger's families for the sloppy initial investigation. He admitted his guilt in accepting the most logical version of events as the only correct one, overlooking all the contradictions. If you think that's the end of the story, then I have another unexpected turn for you. Even after the conviction, many doubted whether Mark had actually done it. But in 2006, those doubts were dispelled. In Mark's prison cell, they found 19 pages of handwritten text in which he was plotting to kill Deanne and another person. Mark wanted to hire a hitman straight from prison through other inmates or people on the outside. His desire to kill Deanne was understandable. He wanted to avenge the woman for revealing all his secrets to the police. The second person on the list was a man named Jeffrey Gelman, his childhood friend. Detectives quickly discovered the reason for such a decision. Mark asked him for $1 million bail, but the friend refused to provide such a sum. From these handwritten pages, it followed that Mark wanted to kidnap the man to get a solid ransom for him and then kill him. Why he needed money for life imprisonment was unclear. Perhaps he planned to eventually get out or escape, but in the end, the man faced another trial and received an additional 35 years in prison for planning a double murder. After that, no one doubted that Mark was the one who killed Donna. Rebecca raised 4 children alone, and they all know what kind of monster their father is. They changed their last names and do not plan to communicate with Mark. In 2019, Rebecca decided that Bailey should renew contact with Donna's relatives who had not seen her since she was 3 years old. Bailey was already 24 at the time, and she went to Florida and had a great time with them. They still communicate, and the young woman learns more about Donna from them. As for Mark, he is still in prison and denies his guilt. Perhaps he would never have been held accountable for what he did if it weren't for 2 factors that happened almost simultaneously. The first is the testimony of his former mistress. She could no longer keep this secret, especially watching how the killer creates a new family and raises children. The second factor is Mark's greed. Almost 4 years after the murder, he decided to sue his employer, Roger Harrington, for a substantial sum, even though he was earning very good money himself. Apparently, he did not expect third-party experts to study the evidence much more carefully than the local detectives. Interestingly, Deanne decided to turn to the police, including after learning about this lawsuit. It became one of the last straws, and the woman revealed Mark's terrible secret. Kate Waring was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. She had 2 brothers and loving parents who tried to give their children the best of everything. Kate demonstrated a love for animals from a young age and started volunteering at various shelters from her teenage years. She also danced, had many friends, and was a very positive person. It seemed to everyone that the woman grew up in a very good environment, and in part, that was the case. But one day, all of that changed. Shortly before going to college, she admitted to her parents that she had been abused as a child by someone close to her family. Apparently, she did not reveal his identity, as this information is nowhere to be found. For Kate's parents, this revelation came as a real shock. They hadn't had the slightest inkling of what their daughter had been through for years. After the woman shared this terrible secret, her mother and father tried in every way to help her, but the consequences of such a trauma over the years only worsened. First, Kate developed problems with alcohol and later with illegal substances. At one point, her parents suggested she get treatment, and the woman agreed. They also encouraged her to go back to their home and live with her family, which was also supposed to help her deal with her problems. At that point, Kate was an adult and living on her own, but she agreed to come home nonetheless. At first, it seemed like therapy was really having a positive effect, but Kate was still unable to let go of the heavy weight of the past and start living life to the fullest. The psychiatrist she went to diagnosed her with depression, but at one point, everything changed. Her father, who constantly supported his daughter and tried his best to help her, offered to take a trip anywhere in the world that Kate chooses. The woman was excited by the idea and soon decided she wanted to go beyond the Arctic Circle. Her dream was to see polar bears. Despite the sad experience, she still had a great love for animals. They set about looking for suitable tours and soon bought tickets. They were to get to the Arctic Circle by ship, and Kate couldn't wait for this exciting journey. At this point, her parents watched as her depressed state was replaced with a cheerful and positive attitude. When they finally went on the trip, Kate was over the moon. She and her father had a great time. The woman gained a lot of positive emotions. On the ship that took them to the Arctic Circle, Kate met another tourist from Russia. Throughout the trip, they communicated and continued to correspond at the end of it. Kate developed a liking for him, and sometime after his arrival home, she decided to go to Russia. There they met again, and the woman even considered staying in the country longer, but she was prevented by problems with her visa renewal, and Kate was forced to return home. In spite of this, it looked as if the woman had finally managed to overcome her depression. She planned to solve her visa problems back home and even began writing a book for her children. It seemed like her life was finally getting better. But on Saturday, June 12, 2009, everything changed. On that day, Kate was home alone while her family was away on business. The woman always called her father to tell him that she was okay, but not this time. Her father decided to call her himself, but Kate didn't pick up. After waiting a while, he asked his wife to come home and check on his daughter. Given her past problems with alcohol and illegal substances, her parents were still worried. When she arrived home, her mother didn't find Kate there. But here's what was strange. The light in her room was on. It looked as if the woman had gone out for a while and would be back soon. The mother waited a few hours, but Kate was still gone. She also discovered that her daughter had left important medications at home that needed to be taken regularly. Despite their concern, the parents decided not to panic and wait for their daughter to show up. After all, Kate was already 28 years old at the time, and her parents understood that she could live her life. The father made the decision to wait until Monday after which he wanted to call the police. On Monday morning, the father received a call from the bank. An employee told him that a man had come into their office and tried to cash more than $4,000 in a check signed by Kate Waring. They could not reach the woman herself, and her father acted as a fiduciary on her account. The whole situation seemed extremely strange. The father knew for a fact that his daughter had only a few $100s in her account, and that was the reason the bank's security service decided to contact him. That said, the woman's own signature looked authentic. They also gave the name of the man who had brought this check. His name was Ethan Mack. The father did not know him, but because of what the bank said about Kate's signature, the real one assumed that this man was indeed an acquaintance of his daughter. Despite this, he still decided to go to the police because Kate was still not in contact. Detectives began investigating the man's disappearance, and the first thing they came up with were questions for Ethan. He stated that he had known Kate for years and that she had written him this check for her old debts. According to Ethan, he often gave her money for clothes, jewelry, and other purchases. After talking to Kate's acquaintances, the police did verify that she had been friends with Ethan for a long time. According to them, there had never been a romantic relationship between them, but they had always been close. Ethan himself said that he and Kate met Friday night and went out to eat at a restaurant. Afterward, he drove her home and left on his own business. He even showed the detectives correspondence with Kate confirming what he said about the dinner. Ethan allowed the detectives to inspect his home, where he lived with his mother and his car. They found nothing suspicious, but the situation with the check still seemed odd to the police, and they were in no hurry to clear him. Eventually, Ethan called the police station and, rather harshly, asked them to leave him alone. The police attempted to reconstruct the chronology of that Friday evening when Kate was last seen. She went to see her therapist in the afternoon, then went to the gym. Next, she went to the store and bought a bottle of wine. Surveillance cameras recorded her talking to someone on the phone at that moment. According to the investigation, she may have been talking to Ethan, who later picked her up, and they went to a restaurant. The woman's parents recalled another disturbing fact. On the day of her disappearance, Kate told them she was in trouble. She refused to specify what it was about, and her parents didn't remember it until a few days later. Alas, none of this helped in any way with the search. As the weeks passed, the woman remained unreachable. Her parents thought the police weren't doing enough from Kate's troubled past. In August, however, the case was given a new chance, and a group of former police officers, led by a lawyer named Andy Savage, took on the case. This group had been investigating cold cases privately, and Kate Waring's case interested them. In all, the group consisted of 5 men, each of whom had extensive law enforcement experience. One of them was former Detective James Randolph, who first examined Kate's bedroom. There, he singled out 2 suspicious things. First, his attention was drawn to a package of medication that the woman was taking on a regular basis. Her parents assured him that she would never skip a drug of her own volition, and the fact that she had left the package at home was really alarming. Second, he discovered Chinese money on Kate's bed. This was strange, for the parents had not the faintest idea where the woman had got it or why she needed it. Next, a team member named Bobby Minter got involved. He specialized in collecting information about a person on the internet and tracking people down. His skills really came in handy. In no time at all, he found out that on the day of her disappearance, around 10 p.m., Kate called her friend named James, but he didn't pick up the phone. Then the woman left him a very disturbing voice message. In it, she stated that someone had stolen her credit cards. He went on to find out that her phone was last active at 1:53 a.m. She called her own voice mailbox number for some reason. Bobby found out that the call was made from the James Island area, which was a few miles from Kate's house. Another member of the team, former homicide detective Eugene Frazier, also found out something interesting. He talked to several acquaintances living in James Island and found out something strange. Ethan Mack, who had volunteered to let the police inspect his and his mother's house, did not actually live there. He was renting an apartment in a building nearby. Eugene was very fortunate to learn these details. The fact is that a close acquaintance of his turned out to be the owner of the very apartment Ethan had rented. Digging deeper, the team of detectives realized that the police did not conduct any proper investigation of Ethan. They only took a cursory look at his mother's house and let it go at that. The team decided to look into the matter on their own. They discovered that Ethan had a girlfriend named Heather Camp. When they asked Kate's parents if they knew the woman, her mother recalled a rather strange story. Kate had met Heather a month before she disappeared. They were on the same train from Washington, D.C., where the woman was dealing with problems with her visa to Russia. After meeting her on the train, Heather told her that her wallet had been stolen, and now she had absolutely nothing to live on. Kate agreed to help and loaned her a certain amount of money. Heather herself said she had gotten a job as a pediatric surgeon in South Carolina and should start in the next few days. A few days later, Heather stated that her daughter had been killed in a car accident in New Jersey, and here her behavior seemed completely illogical. Heather did not go there, and from her demeanor, it seemed that her daughter's death did not upset her much. The team of detectives discovered another curious fact. An Indiana fraud case had been filed against Heather. The reason for this was that she was posing as a licensed doctor, forging the necessary documents. Thus, the team gathered an impressive set of data that forced them to look at the case from a different angle. They turned all this information over to the police, but they were totally unwilling to investigate further. So the team realized their only chance to get the cops moving was to present them with unequivocal evidence implicating Ethan and Heather in Kate's disappearance. To achieve this goal, the team went to extreme measures. First, Eugene Frazier asked an acquaintance of his who rented Ethan's apartment to install a hidden camera in front of the door of his apartment. What's more, they installed a hidden GPS tracker on Ethan's car. This allowed the team to track his movements and see what he was up to. It wasn't long before it paid off. After studying Ethan's itinerary, the former detectives determined that he had been to multiple pawn shops throughout the city. They followed his footsteps and learned that at each of these pawn shops, the man sold various pieces of jewelry in small batches. Alas, they were unable to find out if the jewelry belonged to Kate, but the detectives felt they were getting close to a clue. After a while, they ran into a serious problem. The owner of the apartment where Ethan and Heather were staying informed them that he was going to evict them for non-payment. The team realized that if they did so, they would lose the ability to monitor their behavior and movements, so they made every effort to convince the owner not to do so. Along with this, the detectives urgently came up with a new plan. They asked the owner to give Ethan and Heather extra time to pay their rent, but on one condition. They both had to sign an agreement under which they would undertake to repay that debt in any case. This ruse worked. As soon as the landlord gave the team this contract, they immediately sent it to the lab. Their purpose was simple: to compare Ethan and Heather's handwriting with Kate's signature on the very check for $4,000, and here they had their long-awaited breakthrough. The specialist stated with absolute certainty that the signature on the check was written by the same person who had signed Heather on the contract. This meant that it was Heather who had forged Kate's signature, but the team was well aware that the lazy police still wouldn't want to listen to them. Something else had to be found, and they came up with a new plan. They convinced the landlord to play along and tell Ethan that the apartment needed to be treated for insects. The head of the team put on an exterminator suit and went to the apartment with the owner. Beforehand, the detectives waited until Ethan left the apartment. Noticing that his car had pulled away from the house, James and the owner went inside. An unpleasant surprise awaited them. Ethan was at home. It turned out that Heather was driving his car, but it was too late to call off the whole operation, so James had to change his plan as he went. They continued to stick to the legend of the need for disinfestation and asked Ethan to wait outside the apartment while the dangerous chemicals were sprayed. Ethan, who suspected nothing, agreed and went outside. At the same moment, James began to carefully search the apartment for any evidence that might link Ethan to Kate's disappearance. James noticed Ethan's backpack and examined its contents. There awaited his first clue: Chinese money. As we recall, the same bills were laying on Kate's bed. Alas, that wasn't the end of his luck. James was unable to find any other potential clues. He and the landlord pretended to do the processing and left. The team needed a plan again. As they studied the camera footage in front of Ethan's apartment, they noticed that one man came in very often. He turned out to be a neighbor of the couple named Terry Williams. The detective speculated that he might know about Ethan and Heather's involvement in Kate's disappearance. So the team took a risky step. They decided to offer Williams an impressive sum of cash if he would tell the police what his friends had done to Kate. They took the bag of cash and went to Williams' apartment with this offer. But here, the detectives had a rather unexpected twist waiting for them. At the time they knocked on Williams' door and told him about their offer, Heather was at his house and heard everything. Apparently, she was cheating on Ethan with Williams. After hearing the detectives talking to her lover, Heather panicked. She called Ethan and hysterically told her what had happened. The team didn't expect this scenario, and over the next few days, they tried to figure out what to do next. But then another surprise happened. Williams called them and invited them to his house for a talk. The detectives arrived at his apartment and Williams spoke. He stated that Ethan and Heather had not told him anything directly, but he suspected that the couple had done something bad to Kate. He then picked up an iPod from the shelf and revealed that Heather had given it to him just days after Kate disappeared, and Williams had assumed that the player belonged to her. The team examined the iPod, and thanks to the serial number, they were able to determine that it did belong to Kate. This set of clues was already enough to once again go to the Charleston Police Department, and this time, the local cops could no longer shrug off their job. After examining everything the team had managed to dig up, they finally arrested Ethan and Heather. At the first interrogation, Heather agreed to cooperate with the investigation on the condition that the police help her get minimal punishment. She stated that Kate's body was on Wadmalaw Island, about 20 miles from her home. Police enlisted a search party and combed the area all day. But Kate's body was not there. It soon became clear that Heather had simply deceived them. Then, Andy Savage decided to resort to another ruse. He realized that Heather was most likely directly connected to Kate's murder, but he met with her and promised to help. Andy offered her a deal. He would do whatever it took to get her off the check forging charges, and she would name the exact location of Kate's body. Heather is convinced that this is her only chance, and she agrees. She said Kate's body is still on the outskirts of Wadmalaw Island, specifically near Polly Point Road. The woman also described a specific location. The team of detectives decided to go there without the police, and they were disappointed. They failed to find Kate, but they returned the next day, and it finally happened. The woman's remains were found. Medical examiners were unable to determine the cause of death, but soon the perpetrators themselves began to speak. In August 2009, Heather signed a confession to murder, obstruction of justice, and bank check fraud. Police discovered that the woman had been a scam artist for years, and on that train from Washington, D.C., she chose Kate as her next victim. She later met Ethan and began dating him. As for Ethan, he was in no hurry to plead guilty, and a trial began in October 2010. Based on testimony from Heather, the prosecution reconstructed the chronology of events. According to their version, on the day of her disappearance, Kate learned that Heather had cheated her and also stolen her credit cards. Kate threatened to tell her father, who would most likely involve the police. Heather told Ethan, who sided with her despite her long friendship with Kate. According to the investigation, Kate had dinner that night, not only with Ethan. Heather was also present. Apparently, the couple was trying to negotiate with Kate to keep the cheating story from escalating. At the restaurant, Heather might have promised Kate to return the credit cards and money that had been in Ethan's apartment. When all three got there, Heather and Ethan could have bided her time and attacked her. The court questioned Heather's version and ultimately sentenced her to 39 years in prison. As for Ethan, he was a little luckier. He was sentenced to 25 years. This difference is due to the fact that Heather was also charged with fraud. What do we have in the end? Because of the actions of one fraudster, events unfolded that could give rise to detective movies. On the one hand, we have Kate, who suffered a severe trauma as a child, affected by alcohol and other substances. She found the strength to change her life for the better and overcame her depression. On the other hand, we have a sad fact in front of us. Her whole life was cut short because of a combination of betrayal and lust for profit. Ethan Mack had been her close friend for years, and for the sake of his new lover, he took part in her murder. There are also the police, who did not do a quality investigation. After learning that the woman had a history of problems with illegal substances, they put the case on the back burner. This is where people who had useful skills and a desire to seek justice came to the rescue. A group of independents did more than the entire police department, and it was only thanks to them that the killers were sent to jail and Kate's family was lifted from their shoulders the heavy burden of ignorance. It is worth clarifying that not all of their methods are legal, but they did get to the truth. And what do you think? Are these mild violations justified?